When love becomes a prison, one woman's desperate flight to freedom. Blood streaked across torn feet, bruises mapping years of terror, a father's fist raised in rage. This is Sarah Whitman's story, a young woman who dared to run from a forced marriage into the vast Nebraska wilderness, where death seemed kinder than the life she'd known. But what she found instead would challenge everything she believed about love, family, and freedom. Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey and comment your city below. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The moon hung like a broken promise over Redemption Creek, Nebraska, casting shadows that seemed to reach for Sarah Whitman as she pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of her father's barn. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one threatening to betray her location. Through the thin walls she could hear them, her father's voice thick with whiskey and rage, and the blacksmith Jeremiah Colt's low, possessive drawl. "She'll come around Ezekiel," Jeremiah was saying, his words slurring together like oil and water. "They always do. A firm hand is all a woman needs to remember her place." "Better be quick about it," her father growled back. "The preacher's coming Tuesday. Want this settled before harvest." Sarah's stomach churned. Tuesday. 3 days. 3 days until they would force her into a dress she didn't choose, speak vows she didn't mean, and hand her over to a man whose hands had already left bruises on her arms when no one was watching. The same hands that had disciplined his first wife until she died in childbirth, though everyone in Redemption Creek pretended not to know the truth about those bruises that never quite healed. She touched her own face gingerly, feeling the swelling around her left eye, where her father had struck her that morning when she dared to say no. "You'll marry who I tell you to marry." He'd roared, his fist connecting before she could dodge. "I fed you for 19 years. You owe me." Owe him. As if love was a debt to be collected, measured in meals and shelter paid back in obedience and silence. Sarah had learned early that love in the Whitman household came with conditions. Love meant keeping quiet when her father stumbled home drunk. Love meant pretending not to see her mother's tears, or the way she flinched whenever Ezekiel raised his voice. Love meant accepting that this was simply how things were, until her mother had finally found her own escape in death, 2 winters ago, leaving Sarah alone with a man who saw her not as a daughter, but as property to be traded. The barn door creaked and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. But it was only the wind carrying with it the scent of coming rain and something else possibility. To the west, beyond the fence posts and the wheat fields beyond the reach of her father's fists, and Jeremiah's hungry eyes stretched the vast Nebraska prairie. Miles and miles of grassland where a person could disappear, could become someone new, or could die trying. Death or freedom. At this moment, Sarah couldn't decide which she wanted more, only that she wanted out. She had prepared as best she could in secret. A knife stolen from the kitchen wrapped in cloth and hidden in her boot. A small pouch of cornmeal, some dried meat, and a canteen of water. Pathetic supplies for a journey into the unknown. But all she could manage without arousing suspicion. She wore her brother's old clothes, dead 3 years now from fever. The pants rough against her legs, but infinitely more practical than the constricting dresses her father insisted she wear. "Where's that girl?" Her father's voice boomed suddenly from the house. "Sarah, get in here." This was it, the moment of choice. She could go inside, accept her fate, marry Jeremiah, and spend the rest of her life as a ghost in her own skin. Or she could run. Sarah ran. Her bare feet, she'd removed her shoes to move more quietly. Flew across the packed earth of the yard, past the chicken coop, where the hens rustled nervously, past the well where she'd drawn water every morning since she was 7, past the fence, where she'd once carved her initials next to her brother's, dreaming of a future that would never come. "Sarah?" Her father's roar split the night. "You get back here right now, or so help me God." But God, Sarah thought bitterly, had never helped her before. Why would he start now? She vaulted the fence with a grace born of desperation, her brother's pants catching briefly on a splinter. Behind her, she heard the crash of the front door being thrown open, saw the yellow splash of lantern light spilling across the yard, heard Jeremiah's voice joining her father's in a chorus of male fury. "She's running! The little witch is running!" Sarah didn't look back. Her feet hit the tall grass of the prairie and she was swallowed by darkness. The grass whipped at her legs, sharp edges cutting through the thin fabric, but she didn't slow. Behind her, more lanterns bloomed like fireflies. They were organizing a search party. The rational part of her mind knew this was insane. A young woman alone on the prairie with barely any supplies and no real destination, it was suicide. But the animal part of her, the part that had been caged for so long, sang with the joy of movement, of choice of action taken rather than endured. She ran north, instinctively avoiding the main road that led to town. They would expect her to seek help from the few friends she had there, maybe try to catch a train east. But Sarah had no friends in Redemption Creek. Her father had made sure of that, isolating her with the dedication of a man who understood that witnesses were dangerous to his kind of love. The grassland seemed endless, a sea of whispering stalks that rose nearly to her shoulders in places. She pushed through, ignoring the burning in her lungs, the stitch in her side, the warm wetness she knew was blood from her torn feet. Behind her, the voices grew fainter, but she could still see the bobbing lights of lanterns spreading out in a search line. Time lost meaning. She ran until her legs trembled, walked until she could run again, always moving north, guided by stars her brother had taught her to read before the fever took him. "See there, Sarah," he'd said, pointing to the sky on one of those rare nights when their father passed out early. "That's the North Star. If you're ever lost, it'll guide you home." But what if you had no home to return to? What if home was the place you were running from? The first light of dawn was painting the eastern horizon a pale pink when Sarah finally collapsed. She had no idea how far she'd traveled, miles certainly, but whether 5 or 15 she couldn't say. Her feet were raw and bleeding, her throat parched despite carefully rationing her water, her body shaking with exhaustion and the morning chill. She found a small depression in the earth, barely more than a dip, where water might collect during rain, and curled into it like a wounded animal. The tall grass provided some cover, but she knew it wouldn't be enough if they were still searching. She needed to keep moving, but her body refused to cooperate. "Please," she whispered to the lightening sky, not sure if she was praying or simply voicing her desperation. "Please, just a little more time." The sun rose fully, a ball of fire that promised another scorching August day. Sarah had thought she knew heat working in her father's fields, but this was different. Without shade, without the ability to seek shelter, the sun became an enemy, as relentless as the men hunting her. She pulled her brother's shirt over her head, creating a makeshift shelter, but the relief was minimal. By midday, her water was gone. She'd tried to ration it, but the heat demanded more than she had to give. Her lips cracked, her tongue felt like leather in her mouth, and her thoughts began to fragment. She saw her mother young and laughing before the years with Ezekiel had worn her down. She saw her brother strong and kind, teaching her to whistle like a meadowlark. She saw herself as a child before she understood that love could be a weapon. The buzzards found her first, circling high above in lazy loops, patient as undertakers. Sarah watched them through eyes that wouldn't quite focus anymore, finding their presence oddly comforting. At least someone would know where she died. At least her father wouldn't get the satisfaction of dragging her back. She didn't hear the horse approaching, her senses too dulled by dehydration and exhaustion. It wasn't until a shadow fell across her that she realized she was no longer alone. With effort that felt like moving mountains, she turned her head and looked up. The figure above her was backlit by the sun, features obscured, but she could make out long, dark hair, skin bronzed by sun, and clothing that was definitely not from Redemption Creek. An Indian. A savage, her father would say. A killer, the townspeople would whisper. Sarah waited for death. At least it would be quick, she thought. At least it wouldn't be Jeremiah. But death didn't come. Instead, the figure knelt beside her, and she found herself looking into eyes the color of river stones, dark and deep and unexpectedly gentle. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it might smile easily, though it wasn't smiling now. He said something in a language she didn't understand, his voice low and questioning. When she couldn't respond, her throat too dry for words, he reached for something at his belt. Sarah flinched, expecting a knife, but it was a water skin. He brought it to her lips, carefully supporting her head with one hand, letting only a small amount of water flow at first. It was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever experienced. She grabbed for the skin, desperate for more, but he pulled it back, shaking his head and saying something that was clearly a warning. Too much too fast, she understood even without the words. For the next few minutes, he fed her water in small sips, patient as a mother with a sick child. Between sips, he studied her torn feet, her bruised face, her brother's clothes, the way she kept glancing south as if expecting pursuit. His expression grew darker with each observation. When she'd had enough water to speak, she croaked out a single word, "Please." He tilted his head and she realized he might not speak English. She tried again, gesturing to herself, and then north. "Need go away." His eyes narrowed and he looked south, then back at her. Then in accented but clear English he said, "Someone hurt you." It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. "My father. He wants. I have to marry. I can't." The words tumbled out in fragments, but he seemed to understand. "You run from marriage?" "From prison," she corrected, then wondered if he would understand the difference. Something in his expression suggested he did. He sat back on his heels, seeming to consider. Sarah waited too exhausted to feel proper fear anymore. Whatever he decided, it had to be better than going back. Finally, he stood and extended his hand to her. "You come with me." Sarah stared at his hand, brown calloused, steady. She thought of all the warnings she'd heard about Indians, all the stories of violence and savagery. Then she thought of her father's fists, Jeremiah's groping hands, the wedding dress waiting for her in Redemption Creek. She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness, steadying her when she swayed. "My name," he said, touching his chest, "is Joseph. Joseph Running Elk." "Sarah," she managed. "Sarah Whitman." "Sarah," he repeated, and somehow her name sounded different in his mouth, like it belonged to someone new, someone who had choices. "You are safe now." Safe. The word was so foreign to her experience that she almost laughed. But as Joseph whistled and a painted horse emerged from a nearby rise as he helped her mount and swung up behind her as they began riding north with the sun on their backs, Sarah began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the word could be true. The rhythm of the horse was hypnotic, and Sarah found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, held secure by Joseph's arm around her waist. She should have been terrified alone with a strange man, a Lakota warrior no less, heading into unknown territory. But his hold was protective rather than possessive, and when she shivered despite the heat, he adjusted his position to shield her from the worst of the sun. They rode for hours, stopping occasionally for water and to rest the horse. Joseph shared dried meat with her, watching to make sure she ate slowly, and showed her how to use a plant he called sage to clean the worst of her wounds. His hands were gentle as he tended her feet, spreading some kind of salve that numbed the pain. "Why?" she asked at one point, as he carefully wrapped her feet in soft leather. "Why are you helping me?" He was quiet for a long moment, focusing on his work. Then he said, "My sister. She was taken to white man's school. They say to teach her to make her civilized." His jaw tightened. "She tried to run home. They catch her, bring her back. She try again and again, until she succeed." He looked up at Sarah. "But her feet, they look like yours when she come home. Bleeding, desperate. So I know what it means to run." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since her mother's death. Is she okay now?" "She is free," Joseph said simply. "That is what matters." As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the grassland gold and amber, Joseph pointed ahead. "My people camp there by the river. You are welcome." Sarah could see smoke rising in the distance, and her stomach clenched with new fear. "Will they? I'm white. Won't they?" "You run from white men," Joseph said with a slight smile. "That makes you friend enough for now." The camp was larger than Sarah had expected, perhaps 30 teepees arranged in a rough circle near a meandering river. Children played in the fading light, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Women tended fires and worked on various tasks, while men gathered in small groups talking and maintaining weapons. It was a scene both foreign and familiar, people living their lives, creating community, being family. Their arrival caused a stir. People emerged from teepees, conversations stopped, and Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. She wanted to shrink to disappear, but Joseph's presence behind her was steady and reassuring. An older woman approached, her face weathered but handsome, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. She spoke rapidly to Joseph in Lakota, gesturing at Sarah with obvious questions. Joseph responded calmly, and Sarah caught her own name among the unfamiliar words. The woman circled Sarah slowly, taking in her injuries, her borrowed clothes, her general state of exhaustion. Then she reached out and gently touched the bruise around Sarah's eye, her fingers barely making contact. She said something sharp to Joseph, who nodded grimly. "My Aunt Maria Crow Feather," Joseph said to Sarah. "She says you stay with her. She will help you heal." Maria said something else, and Joseph translated. "She wants to know if the men who hurt you will come looking." Sarah's throat tightened. "Probably. My father, he doesn't like to lose things he thinks he owns." Joseph translated, and Maria's expression grew fierce. She spoke again, her voice carrying enough force that several nearby warriors looked over with interest. "She says," Joseph translated, a slight smile playing at his lips, "that your father will learn that not everything can be owned, and that some things when freed grow claws." Over the next several days, Sarah discovered what it meant to be cared for without conditions. Maria and the other women tended her wounds with practiced efficiency, using plants and methods that seemed like magic compared to the harsh medicine of Redemption Creek. They fed her rich broths that rebuilt her strength and taught her words in Lakota, laughing gently at her pronunciation, but encouraging her efforts. Joseph visited daily, sometimes bringing small gifts, a pair of moccasins to replace her torn feet's bandages, a comb carved from bone, a handful of wild berries that burst sweet and tart on her tongue. He taught her practical things, how to find water by watching birds, how to read the sky for weather, how to move through tall grass without leaving an obvious trail. "You teach me to survive," Sarah said one evening as they sat by the river watching the sun paint the water gold. "But why I'm nobody to you?" Joseph was quiet for a moment, skipping stones across the water's surface. "You are somebody to yourself," he said finally. "That is enough." It was during her second week in the camp that Sarah began to understand the fundamental difference between the world she'd fled and the one she'd found. Here, women had voices that were heard. They owned property, made decisions, chose their own paths. She watched Maria negotiate with traders, her authority unquestioned. She saw women warriors returning from hunts, their skills celebrated. She observed marriages that seemed built on partnership rather than possession. "I don't understand," she confessed to Joseph one day as they watched his cousin teaching her daughter to shoot a bow. "Where I come from, we're taught that we're weak, that we need men to protect us, to make decisions for us." Joseph looked genuinely puzzled. "But women give life. They are the first teachers, the keepers of wisdom. How can the ones who create warriors be weak?" It was such a simple inversion of everything she'd been taught that Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like a bone that had been broken and set wrong finally being corrected. As the days passed, Sarah began to shed her old self like a snake leaving behind outgrown skin. She learned to ride properly, not side saddle like a lady, but astride like someone who had places to go. She learned to shoot Joseph patiently, correcting her stance, her grip, her aim, until she could hit a target more often than not. She learned to read tracks to skin game to build a fire that would last the night. But more than skills, she learned to laugh again. The children of the camp adopted her as a curiosity, teaching her their games and delighting in her attempts at their language. The women included her in their daily work, their gossip, their jokes. Even the men initially suspicious began to nod in acknowledgement when she passed. It was Maria who gave her the name that would become her own. They were sitting together one evening working on beating Sarah's clumsy attempts, making Maria smile when an eagle feather drifted down from the darkening sky, landing in Sarah's lap. Maria's eyes widened. She spoke rapidly in Lakota, calling others over to see. Soon a small crowd had gathered, all talking excitedly. "What is it?" Sarah asked Joseph, who had appeared at the commotion. "Eagle feathers are sacred," he explained, his own expression showing surprise. "They don't just fall, they are given. Maria says, she says you should be called Wiyaka Wind Feather Woman. The eagle marks you as one who will fly free." Sarah held the feather carefully, its weight both negligible and profound. "Feather Woman," she repeated softly. It felt right in a way her given name never had. That night she dreamed not of her father's house, but of soaring over endless grasslands, the wind beneath wings she'd grown herself. The peace was shattered 3 weeks after her arrival. Sarah was helping Maria prepare the evening meal. When she heard it, horses, many of them approaching from the south. Her blood turned to ice. Joseph appeared at her side as if summoned by her fear. "Stay calm," he said quietly. "We will handle this." But Sarah recognized the voice that boomed across the camp before the riders even came into view. "I know you've got her, Sarah Whitman. You come out now, girl, or things are going to get ugly." Her father. And from the sound of it, he'd brought half of Redemption Creek with him. Sarah started to stand, but Maria's hand on her arm stopped her. The older woman shook her head firmly, then rose herself, walking toward the gathering confrontation with the dignity of a queen. Through the teepee's opening, Sarah could see her father dismounting, his face red with rage and alcohol. Jeremiah was beside him, along with Sheriff Watson and at least 10 other men, all armed. The warriors of the camp had formed a loose line, weapons visible but not raised. It was a delicate balance, violence held in check by the thinnest of threads. "We don't want trouble," Sheriff Watson was saying, though his hand rested on his pistol. "We're just here for the girl. She belongs to her father, and he's within his rights to take her home." Joseph stepped forward. "She is guest here. She stays by her choice." "Her choice?" Ezekiel spat. "She's my daughter. She doesn't get a choice." "All people have choice," Joseph replied calmly. "This is our way." Jeremiah pushed forward, his face twisted with possessive fury. "She's promised to me we have an agreement." "Agreement with who?" Maria asked in accented English. "With her or with him?" She pointed at Ezekiel. "That's none of your concern, woman," Jeremiah snarled. Maria smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Everything that happens in our camp is our concern, man." The tension ratcheted higher. Sarah could see her father's hand moving toward his gun, could see the warriors tensing in response. Someone was going to die if she didn't act. She stood and walked out of the tipi. "Sarah!" Her father's voice held triumph. "Get over here, now!" Sarah stood between the two groups, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. This was it, the moment that would define everything that came after. She could go with her father, return to the life she'd fled, submit to the marriage that would kill her soul, if not her body. Or she could choose the uncertain freedom she'd found here, knowing it might spark violence. She looked at her father, really looked at him for perhaps the first time. He was smaller than she remembered, his power revealed as nothing more than bluster and fear. She looked at Jeremiah, saw the hunger in his eyes that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. Then she turned and looked at Joseph, at Maria, at the people who had shown her kindness without asking for payment, who had given her a name that meant freedom. "I will not go," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "I choose my path, and it is not with you." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Ezekiel's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little, you're coming home if I have to drag you." He started forward, but Joseph stepped between them. "She has spoken. Get out of my way, savage." Ezekiel reached for his gun. What happened next occurred so fast that Sarah would need others to tell her about it later. Joseph moved like water, disarming her father before the gun cleared its holster. Other warriors stepped forward, weapons raised as the white men went for their own guns. For a moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then a child's scream cut through the tension. Everyone turned to see a young boy pointing at the river where the water was rising with impossible speed. "Flash flood!" someone shouted, and suddenly personal conflicts became irrelevant in the face of nature's fury. The wall of water hit the camp like the fist of God. Tipis were swept away, horses screamed, people ran in all directions seeking higher ground. Sarah was caught by the current, pulled under her lungs, burning as she struggled to surface. Strong hands grabbed her, pulled her up. Joseph, his face grim with determination, swimming powerfully toward the shore. But the current was too strong, pulling them both toward the rapids she could hear roaring ahead. Then she saw him, Jeremiah, clinging to a log nearby, reaching for his gun. Even now, even in the midst of catastrophe, his hatred more important than survival. He aimed at Joseph, and Sarah didn't think. She let go of Joseph, with one hand grabbed the knife from her boot, the one she'd carried since that night in her father's barn, and threw it with all the desperate strength she possessed. The blade found its mark. Jeremiah's eyes widened in shock, the gun falling from his hand as he clutched at his chest. Then the current took him, and he was gone. Sarah had killed a man. She waited to feel guilt, horror, regret. Instead, she felt only a wild, fierce joy. She had chosen. She had acted. She had saved the man who had saved her. Joseph pulled them both to shore where others were gathering, helping each other, counting the living and the lost. Sarah's father was there, waterlogged and diminished, staring at her with something that might have been fear. "You killed him," he said, his voice hollow. "You killed Jeremiah." "He would have killed Joseph," Sarah replied, surprised by her own steadiness. "I chose who deserved to live." Her father looked at her, really looked at her, and perhaps for the first time saw not his property, but a person separate and whole and dangerous when cornered. Without another word, he turned and walked away, gathering the surviving men from Redemption Creek, leaving without looking back. Sarah knew she would never see him again. The knowledge felt like freedom. The flood had destroyed much of the camp, but the people endured as they always had, coming together to rebuild, to mourn the loss, to celebrate the survived. Sarah worked alongside them, no longer a guest, but a member of the community, her actions during the flood having sealed her place among them. It was Maria who performed the ceremony a week after the waters receded. She marked Sarah's face with paint, spoke words in Lakota that Joseph translated. "You are no longer Sarah Whitman. That girl died in the water. You are Wayaka Wind Feather Woman, she who chose freedom, she who protects her people. You are Lakota now, not by blood, but by choice, which is stronger." Sarah Wayaka Wind felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She was no longer running from something, but moving toward something, toward a life she was building with her own hands, toward a future she was choosing with each breath. That evening, as the camp settled into sleep, Joseph found her by the river. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars reflect on the now calm water. "You saved my life," he said finally. "You saved mine first," she replied. "Then we are even." Sarah turned to look at him. This man who had shown her that strength could be gentle, that protection didn't require possession. "No," she said softly. "We are just beginning." He smiled then, that easy smile she'd imagined the first day they met, and Sarah felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with possibility. The night was warm, the stars bright, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried a sound that no longer seemed like loneliness, but like freedom, like coming home, like the promise of wings that were finally truly her own. The morning after Joseph had spoken those words by the river, Sarah woke to find the world transformed. Not the physical world, the camp still bore the scars of the flood typies being rebuilt, belongings being salvaged from mud, but her inner landscape had shifted like the prairie after rain, everything familiar, yet somehow new. She lay on her buffalo hide in Maria's teepee, listening to the older woman's gentle snoring, and tried to understand this feeling blooming in her chest. It wasn't love not yet, but it was possibility, and for someone who had never believed in possibilities, it felt like witnessing the sunrise for the first time. Joseph was already at work when she emerged, helping to raise the frame of a new teepee. His muscles moved smoothly under his skin as he lifted the heavy poles, and Sarah found herself watching with an appreciation that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with being a woman who was finally allowed to have desires of her own. In Redemption Creek, even looking at a man who wasn't your husband or father was considered sinful. Here she could look. She could choose. She could want. "You stare like a hawk watching a rabbit," Maria said beside her, making Sarah jump. The older woman's eyes twinkled with amusement. "But I think perhaps he is not entirely rabbit, and you are not entirely hawk." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. I was just—" "You were just being young and alive," Maria said gently. "This is good. For too long I think you were only surviving. Now you begin to live." Living. Such a simple word for such a complex thing. Over the following weeks, Sarah discovered what living meant when fear wasn't your constant companion. She learned to wake without immediately checking for danger to eat, without wondering if the meal came with a price to speak, without weighing each word for its potential to cause anger. Joseph became her teacher in more than just survival skills. He taught her the stories of his people, sitting with her in the evenings as the camp settled into rest, his voice painting pictures of heroes and spirits of times when the buffalo covered the plains like a dark sea of prophecies and promises that shaped the Lakota understanding of the world. "Tell me about the stars," she asked one night as they sat outside Maria's teepee. The older woman had conspicuously found elsewhere to be leaving them alone with a knowing smile. Joseph looked up at the vast canopy above them. "Each star is a spirit," he said. "The ones who came before us, watching, guiding. See that pattern there? We call it the bear. He was once a man who loved a woman from the sky people. Their love was forbidden, but so strong that when he died, the spirits placed him in the sky so he could be close to her forever." "That's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "In my world, the stories were all about punishment. About women who loved wrong being turned to salt or cursed or killed." "Your world sounds lonely," Joseph observed. "It was," Sarah admitted, "but I'm not in that world anymore." He turned to look at her, then his dark eyes serious in the moonlight. "No," he agreed. "You are not. But Wiyaka win. You must understand my world is not easy either. My people face dangers your people bring. Soldiers, settlers, diseases. The buffalo grow fewer each year, the land they want to take. To be with us is to be part of this struggle." Sarah thought of her father's house of Jeremiah's hands, of a life mapped out for her in dishes and bruises and silence. "I've lived in a cage," she said. "I would rather die free than live safe." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. "You speak like a warrior," he said. "Maybe I am one," Sarah replied, surprised by her own boldness. "Maybe I just needed to find my battlefield." The next day brought that battlefield to her in an unexpected form. A hunting party returned with news that made the camp buzz with tension. Soldiers had been spotted 2 days' ride to the east, more than had been seen before, and they were asking questions about a white woman living with the Lakota. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. "They're looking for me." "Perhaps," Joseph said, his face grim. "Or perhaps they use you as excuse. They have wanted reason to move us from this land. A stolen white woman would give them that reason." "But I wasn't stolen," Sarah protested. "I chose to come here." Standing Bull, one of the elder warriors, shook his head. "Your choice matters nothing to them. They see what they want to see." Maria spoke up, her voice sharp with decades of anger. "They took my sister's children to their schools, said it was for their own good. When she went to get them back, they said she had no right, that the children belonged to the government now. Choice rights. These are words they use when it serves them, forget when it doesn't." Sarah felt the weight of what her presence might mean settling on her shoulders. "I should leave," she said. "If my being here puts you all in danger, no." Joseph's voice was firm. "You are one of us now. We do not abandon our people. But if the soldiers come, then we will face them as we always have," Standing Bull said, "with wisdom when we can, with strength when we must." That night Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the camp's quiet sounds, a baby crying quickly soothed, dogs barking at something in the distance, the wind moving through the grass with its endless whisper. This place had become home in a way Redemption Creek never was. These people had become family in a way her blood relations never were. The thought of bringing destruction to them because of her presence was unbearable. She was still awake when the scout rode in just before dawn, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. His words spoken in rapid Lakota sent the camp into controlled chaos. The soldiers weren't just coming, they were less than a day away, and they had a warrant for Sarah's return signed by a federal judge. "They say you were kidnapped." Joseph translated, his jaw tight with anger. "They say we are holding you against your will." Sarah laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "My will. When has my will ever mattered to them?" The camp council gathered quickly, and to Sarah's surprise, she was invited to join them. In Redemption Creek, women were never included in important decisions. Here she sat among the leaders as an equal, her voice carrying the same weight as any warrior's. I won't let you fight for me, she said. Too many would die. And if we give you up? Maria asked. You think you survive what they do to you. You killed a white man even if he deserved it. They will hang you. Sarah hadn't thought of that. In the chaos of the flood in the immediate aftermath, she'd forgotten that she had killed Jeremiah. By white law, she was a murderer. Then I run, she said. Lead them away from here. You would not make it a day, Standing Bull said, not unkindly. They have horses, dogs, guns. You are brave, Wiaka Win, but you are not yet skilled enough to escape them alone. Then what? Sarah asked, frustration coloring her voice. I won't be the reason this camp is destroyed. It was Joseph who spoke next, his words measured and careful. There is another way. If you were married to one of us truly married with witnesses, they could not take you. You would be Lakota by marriage, not just by adoption. The treaty gives us right to our own people. The teepee fell silent. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she understood what he was suggesting. Marriage. To him, she assumed, though he hadn't said it directly. That's a big step, she managed. It is Joseph agreed, and not one to take lightly, but it would protect you and give us legal ground to stand on. Sarah looked around the circle of faces, saw the mixture of hope and concern in their expressions. Then she looked at Joseph. Really looked at him. She thought of the gentleness in his hands when he'd tended her wounds, the patience in his teaching, the way he looked at her like she was something precious, but not fragile. Would you? She paused, gathered her courage. Would this be real, or just for protection? Joseph met her eyes steadily. I do not know you well enough to promise love, he said honestly, but I know you well enough to promise respect, partnership, truth. The rest we would discover together. It was more honesty than she'd ever gotten from a man, and somehow that made her trust him more than any pretty words could have. Yes, she said simply. The ceremony happened that afternoon as scouts kept watch for the approaching soldiers. It was nothing like the wedding that had been planned for her in Redemption Creek. No white dress that felt like a shroud. No church that felt like a tomb. No vows that felt like chains. Instead, there was smoke from sacred herbs, songs that seemed to rise from the earth itself, and promises made in 2 languages under an endless sky. Maria painted Sarah's face with symbols she didn't yet understand, but that felt right on her skin. The women of the camp dressed her in soft doeskin decorated with beads and quills, each element carrying meaning: blue for the sky that witnessed their union, red for the strength of their combined spirit, white for the new beginning they were creating together. Joseph wore his finest clothing, looking every inch the warrior, but his eyes were soft when they found hers across the ceremonial circle. When he took her hands, his grip was steady, grounding her in the moment. The vows were simple. They promised to walk together to share their strengths and support each other's weaknesses to build something new from the ashes of what had been. When Joseph placed a string of shells around her neck, he whispered, "You are not property to be owned, but a partner to stand beside. This I swear." Sarah had to blink back tears. In all her imaginings of marriage, she had never dared dream of being seen as an equal. The celebration was interrupted by the thunder of approaching horses. The soldiers had arrived sooner than expected, and they came in force, at least 30 men armed and ready for conflict. At their head rode a captain. Sarah didn't recognize his uniform, crisp despite the dust of travel, his face set in lines of bureaucratic determination. "I am Captain Morrison," he announced, his voice carrying across the camp. "I'm here for Sarah Whitman, who is being held against her will." Sarah stepped forward, Joseph beside her. "I am here of my own choosing," she said clearly. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, the Lakota clothing, the ceremonial paint still on her face. "Miss Whitman, you're clearly under duress. These savages have—" "These people," Sarah interrupted, "are my family, and I am no longer Miss Whitman." She took Joseph's hand. "I am Wiaka Win, wife of Joseph Running Elk, member of this band by choice and by right." "That's not possible," Morrison said. "Christian marriage." "We are not Christians here," Standing Bull said calmly. "Our marriages are recognized by treaty. You have no authority over our people." Morrison's face reddened. "She's a white woman. She belongs with her own kind." "I belong where I choose to belong." Sarah said. And I choose here. You're making a mistake, Morrison warned. Your father has friends' influence. This won't end here. Then let him come himself, Sarah challenged. Let him face me, not hide behind soldiers and papers. Morrison looked like he wanted to argue further, but one of his lieutenants whispered something in his ear, probably reminding him that starting a conflict over a woman who claimed to be there willingly would not look good in reports. This isn't over, he said finally, then wheeled his horse around. The soldiers followed, though several cast curious glances back at the white woman who had chosen a life they couldn't understand. As the dust of their departure settled, Sarah felt Joseph's hand tighten around hers. You were brave, he said. I was terrified, she admitted. The two are not opposite things, he replied. Fear tells us something matters. Brave is acting, despite the fear. That night, as the camp celebrated both the marriage and the soldiers' departure, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of the firelight, watching her new people dance and sing. Joseph stood beside her close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not touching, respecting the boundaries of their still new connection. Are you sorry, she asked, to be tied to someone you barely know? He considered the question. I know you fight for those you care about. I know you choose freedom over safety. I know you learn quickly and laugh deeply when you think no one is watching. This is enough to begin. And if it's not enough to continue, he turned to her, then his expression serious. Then we will face that truth together. But Wiaka win. I think perhaps we both have been alone long enough. Maybe it is time to see what we can build together. Over the following weeks, they began that building. It was awkward at first, two people learning to share space to navigate the intimacy of marriage without the foundation of long courtship. They had separate sleeping arrangements, initially Joseph respecting her need for time and space, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. But slowly, incrementally, they grew closer. Sarah learned that Joseph talked in his sleep, usually in Lakota, sometimes calling out warnings or instructions that made her wonder what battles he fought in his dreams. Joseph learned that Sarah hummed when she was content old hymns from her childhood that she'd reclaimed and made her own. They hunted together, Joseph teaching her to move silently through the grass, to read the wind, to shoot with increasing accuracy. Sarah discovered she had a natural talent for tracking her eyes, picking up subtle signs that even Joseph sometimes missed. You see like you're looking for escape routes, he observed one day, as she pointed out a deer trail he hadn't noticed. I spent years looking for escape routes, she replied. Now I'm just better at seeing paths. They shared stories in the evening building, understanding through words. Joseph told her about his childhood, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the first buffalo hunt where he'd frozen in fear and shame about his father's death in a skirmish with Crow warriors when he was 12. Sarah reciprocated with her own truths the first time her father had hit her. She was 7, had spilled milk the way her mother had grown quieter each year until she barely spoke at all, the relief she'd felt when her brother died, because at least he was free. That's terrible, Joseph said when she admitted the last part. Is it? Sarah asked. He was in pain always from the fever, and living in that house, death seemed kinder. No, Joseph clarified. It's terrible that death seemed kinder than life. No child should feel that. It was during a hunting trip, just the two of them tracking elk through a valley 2 days from camp, that things shifted between them. They'd made camp for the night, a small fire keeping the dark at bay, when Sarah noticed Joseph favoring his left shoulder. You're hurt, she said. It's nothing. Old injury that complains sometimes. Let me see. He hesitated, then pulled off his shirt, revealing a mass of scar tissue across his shoulder blade. Sarah sucked in a breath. Soldiers, he said simply. 3 winters ago. They wanted us to move. We disagreed. Sarah moved behind him, her fingers ghosting over the scars. She'd seen enough wounds to know this one had nearly killed him. You survived this. Maria is a good healer, and I had reasons to live. What reasons? He turned to face her, and suddenly the space between them seemed both too much and not enough. I believed there was something worth waiting for. Someone, perhaps. Sarah's breath caught. Joseph? I know we married for protection, he said quickly. I do not expect... She kissed him. It was clumsy, graceless, her first real kiss that wasn't stolen or forced, but it was hers to give and his to receive, and that made it perfect. When they pulled apart, Joseph's eyes were wide with surprise. "Wiaka win." "Sarah," she said, "when we're alone, I'd like you to call me Sarah sometimes. Not because I'm going back to who I was, but because I want you to know all of me, even the parts I'm learning to leave behind." "Sarah," he said softly, like he was tasting the name. Sarah. They didn't become lovers that night. Sarah wasn't ready, and Joseph wouldn't push, but they became something more than strangers bound by necessity. They became partners beginning to choose each other for reasons beyond survival. The challenges came as challenges always do. There were members of the band who resented Sarah's presence, who saw her as a liability or an outsider who would never truly understand their ways. There were moments when the cultural divide seemed too vast to bridge, when Sarah would make mistakes that revealed her ignorance, when Joseph would assume knowledge she didn't have. One particularly difficult moment came when Sarah tried to help with preparing a buffalo hide, a task she'd observed but never attempted. She used the wrong technique, potentially ruining a valuable hide, and the woman whose hide it was, Joseph's cousin Mary Stands Tall, erupted in anger. "You stupid white woman," Mary shouted. "You think you can play at being Lakota, but you know nothing. You waste what we cannot afford to lose." Sarah felt heat flood her face, shame and anger warring in her chest. "I was trying to help." "Your help is worthless. Go back to your own people where you belong." "Mary!" Joseph's voice cut through the confrontation. "Enough!" "You defend her!" Mary turned on him. "She ruins a hide that could feed a family, and you defend her." "She makes a mistake while learning," Joseph said evenly, "as you did when you were young, as we all did." "She is not a child. She is a grown woman who should know better." "She is learning to know better," Maria interjected, approaching the group. "And you, Mary Stands Tall, might remember that teaching is more useful than shouting." Mary stormed off, and Sarah stood frozen, the ruined hide at her feet, a symbol of all the ways she didn't belong. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be sorry," Maria said firmly. "Be better, learn, try again." But Sarah saw the looks from others, heard the whispers. That night she sat alone by the river, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, if she was fooling herself, thinking she could ever truly belong here. Joseph found her there, sitting beside her without speaking for a long moment. Finally he said, "When I was young, maybe 8 winters, I tried to join a raid against the Crow. I wanted to prove I was a warrior. I followed the war party in secret, but I was discovered. My presence alerted the Crow to our approach. 3 of our warriors died because of my stupidity." Sarah looked at him surprised. "What happened?" "I wanted to die from shame, but my uncle, he told me something. He said shame is only useful if it teaches us. Otherwise it is just another kind of death. You made a mistake today. Will you let it teach you or destroy you?" "Teach me," Sarah said after a moment. "I want it to teach me." "Then tomorrow you learn the right way to prepare a hide, and the day after you teach someone else. This is how we grow." The next morning, Mary Stands Tall was waiting for Sarah, a fresh hide laid out between them. "I will show you," she said stiffly. "Once. Pay attention." It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. Sarah paid attention, learned, and when the hide was properly prepared, Mary nodded with grudging approval. "Better?" she said, and coming from her, it felt like high praise. As autumn approached, the band prepared to move to their winter grounds, and Sarah experienced her first real migration. It was a massive undertaking, taking down an entire camp, packing everything onto horses and travois, moving dozens of families across the prairie to a more sheltered valley where they would spend the cold months. Sarah worked alongside the other women, learning the intricate system of organization that made such movement possible. Everything had its place, its method of packing its priority. Children and elders rode warriors, scouted and guarded women, managed the logistics that kept everyone alive and together. "You're stronger than when you came," Maria observed, watching Sarah load a heavy pack onto a horse without assistance. Not just in body. It was true. Months of physical work, adequate food, and freedom from constant fear had transformed Sarah's body. Where she had once been soft and pale, she was now lean and brown from the sun. Her hands, once smooth, were calloused and capable. But more than that, her spirit had strengthened. She walked without hunching, spoke without whispering, existed without apology. The winter camp was in a valley protected by bluffs near a river that wouldn't freeze completely. As the band settled in preparing for the long, cold months ahead, Sarah felt a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Winter in her father's house had meant being trapped indoors with his moods no escape from the violence that seemed to worsen with the cold. Here, winter meant stories around fires, time for crafting and creating a drawing together of community against the harsh season. It was during the first snowfall that Sarah and Joseph truly became husband and wife. They had been sharing a tippy for weeks by then, but still maintaining separate sleeping arrangements. That night, as the snow fell silent and thick outside, Sarah made a choice. "Joseph," she said softly in the darkness. "Yes, I'm cold." It was a lie she was warm enough in her buffalo robes, but it was also an invitation. She heard him shift, considering understanding. "Would you like to share warmth?" he asked carefully. "Yes." He moved to her, then bringing his robes, settling beside her with careful deliberation. For a moment they lay side by side, not touching the space between them, electric with possibility. "Sarah," he whispered. "I'm not afraid, welcome," she said, and realized it was true. For the first time in her life, she was not afraid of a man's touch, because this man had proven 100 times over that his touch meant safety, not harm. What followed was gentle and patient, and nothing like the violent claiming she had been taught to expect. Joseph treated her body like something precious, seeking permission in every touch, every kiss, every escalation of intimacy. When she tensed, he stopped. When she relaxed, he continued. It was a conversation without words, a negotiation of souls as much as bodies. Afterwards, as they lay entwined, Sarah felt something break open inside her chest. Not breaking like damage, but breaking like an egg, letting something new emerge. "I think I love you," she said into the darkness, surprised by her own words. Joseph's arms tightened around her. "I think I love you too," he replied. "Not think. No. I know I love you, Wiyaka Win. Sarah, my wife." Winter deepened, and with it came new challenges. Food grew scarce as game became harder to find. The government supplies that had been promised by treaty failed to arrive as they so often did. The band rationed carefully, but hunger became a constant companion. Sarah learned what it meant to be truly hungry, not the missed meals of punishment she'd known before, but the deep gnawing hunger of scarcity. She learned to make soup from bones that had already been boiled 3 times, to find nutrition in things she would have considered inedible before certain barks, dried berries that were more seed than fruit, the marrow from bones cracked with rocks. She also learned the strength of community in hardship. No one hoarded. Everyone shared. When a successful hunt brought meat, it was distributed equally. When someone fell ill, others gave from their portions to help them recover. It was so different from Redemption Creek, where her father had extra, while neighbors starved, where charity came with conditions and judgment. It was during the worst of the winter storms that soldiers came again. Not to take Sarah this time, but with news that made the entire camp go silent with dread. "All Lakota are to report to the agency by spring," the sergeant announced, reading from an official document. "Any bands remaining outside designated areas after April 1st will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly." "This is our land," Standing Bull protested. The treaty has been modified," the sergeant interrupted. "You can come peacefully to the agency, or you can be brought by force. Those are your only options." After the soldiers left, the council met long into the night. Sarah sat with the women, listening to the debate that would determine all their futures. Some argued for compliance, saying it was better to survive at the agency than die fighting. Others argued for resistance, saying that life without freedom wasn't life at all. "What will we do?" Sarah asked Joseph later as they lay together in their teepee. "I don't know," he admitted. "To go to the agency means giving up everything, our way of life, our freedom, our spirits. But to fight means many will die, probably all of us, eventually." Sarah thought of the choice she'd made months ago, running into the prairie rather than submitting to a life of captivity. "I said I'd rather die free than live safe," she reminded him. "That was your choice to make alone," Joseph pointed out. "Now your choice affects others, the children, the elders. Can we choose death for them?" It was a question without an easy answer, one that haunted the camp through the long winter nights. Some families began to pack, preparing to go to the agency. Others began to prepare for war. The band that had taken Sarah in, that had given her a new life and name, was fracturing under the pressure of an impossible choice. Spring came early that year, the snow melting in sudden warmth that turned the earth to mud and set the rivers running high. With it came decision time. The band would split. Those who chose the agency would go. Those who chose to remain free would head north, hoping to find refuge with Sitting Bull's people, or perhaps cross into Canada. Sarah and Joseph chose freedom, as she'd known they would. But the parting was painful. Families divided, friendships severed by necessity and different definitions of survival. Mary Stands Tall, who had become a friend after their rocky beginning, chose the agency. "I have children," she said simply. "I cannot watch them starve or be shot. At the agency, they will at least live." "Will they?" Sarah asked. "Or will they just exist?" Mary's expression was infinitely sad. "Sometimes existing is all we can manage. You're still new to being hunted Wiaka-Win. You don't yet know how exhausting it becomes." The band that headed north was smaller, maybe 40 people, mostly warriors, and younger families, those who still had the strength and hope for resistance. Maria came with them, declaring she was too old to learn new ways and would rather die as Lakota than live as whatever the agency would make her become. They moved carefully, avoiding known soldier patrols, using all the knowledge generations of Plains living had given them. But they were racing against time and history, and everyone knew it. It was during this flight north that Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly, the morning sickness she attributed to travel. The exhaustion she blamed on stress, the changes in her body she tried to ignore. But when she missed her second monthly blood, she knew. She told Joseph by the river where they'd stopped to water the horses, whispering the news like it was either a blessing or a curse, she wasn't sure which. His face went through a series of expressions: joy, fear, worry, and finally, determination. "A child," he said softly, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "Our child." "Is it fair?" Sarah asked. "To bring a child into this—" "Was it fair when any of us were born?" Joseph countered. "Life is never fair, but it is still precious." That night he held her closer than usual, and Sarah felt the weight of the future they were creating, not just for themselves now, but for the next generation. A child who would be both white and Lakota, belonging fully to neither world, but perhaps hopefully able to bridge them. The news of her pregnancy spread through the band quickly, and with it came a shift in how people treated her. The remaining doubters seemed to soften. A woman carrying a Lakota child was truly one of them, bound by blood as well as choice. The women fussed over her, sharing remedies for morning sickness advice for the months to come, stories of their own pregnancies. But it also added urgency to their flight. A pregnant woman couldn't ride as hard, couldn't move as fast. They were vulnerable in a way they hadn't been before. It was Standing Bull who made the suggestion that would change everything. "There's a place," he said during council, "a valley hidden that my grandfather told me about, where the old ones used to winter before the whites came. It's far from any trails the soldiers use, protected with water and game. We could go there at least until the child is born." "And after?" someone asked. "After we see what the world looks like," Standing Bull replied. "But for now, we survive." The journey to the Hidden Valley took 2 weeks through increasingly difficult terrain. They had to abandon the travois, carrying only what they could pack on horses. But when they finally crested the last ridge and looked down into the valley, Sarah gasped. It was paradise hidden in plain sight, a bowl of green surrounded by protective ridges, a clear stream running through its heart trees for shelter, and firewood meadows where game would graze. It was like the earth had created a sanctuary just for them. "Home," Joseph said softly beside her. "For now." Sarah agreed, but she was already imagining it, their child taking first steps in those meadows, learning to swim in that stream, growing up with at least a taste of the freedom their parents had fought to preserve. As the band descended into the valley, beginning the work of setting up what might be their last free camp, Sarah felt the child move inside her for the first time, a flutter like bird wings, like hope taking flight, like the future announcing itself despite all odds. She was no longer Sarah Whitman, the frightened girl who had run into the prairie. She was Wiaka-Win Feather Woman. wife of Joseph running elk, mother-to-be member of a people who refused to surrender their souls, even as their world collapsed around them. She had learned that love wasn't possession, but partnership, that family wasn't blood, but choice, that freedom wasn't the absence of struggle, but the right to choose your own battles. The sun set behind the western ridge, painting the valley gold, and Sarah stood with her hand on her growing belly, Joseph's arm around her shoulders, their people making camp around them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, soldiers might find them. Winter would come again. The child would be born into uncertainty. But tonight, in this moment, in this hidden valley that felt like the earth's gift to the dispossessed, they were free. The hidden valley had sheltered them through spring and into summer, becoming more than a refuge. It had become a world unto itself, where Sarah's belly grew round with promise, and the band lived as their ancestors had, following the old ways without interference from soldiers or settlers. But even paradise could not hold back the tide of history forever, and on a morning in late July, when the heat shimmered off the grass like water, their sanctuary was breached. Sarah was by the stream, washing clothes with Maria and two other women, when she heard it, the sound that had haunted her dreams since leaving Redemption Creek. Her father's voice carried on the wind like a curse, bellowing her name across the valley. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitman, I know you're here. Show yourself." Her hands froze in the cold water, the shirt she'd been washing floating away downstream. Maria grabbed her arm, steadying her as her whole body began to shake. "How?" Sarah whispered. "How did he find us?" But there was no time for questions. Joseph was already running toward them, his face grim, and she could see warriors taking positions along the ridges. Her father hadn't come alone. She counted at least 20 men spread out along the valley's entrance, some in uniform, others clearly hired guns, all armed and ready for violence. "Stay behind me," Joseph said, but Sarah shook her head. "No, this is my fight. He's here for me." She stood her 7 months pregnant belly, making the movement awkward, but her spine straight with determination. The woman her father had tried to break was gone, replaced by someone who had learned her own strength. She walked toward the confrontation, Joseph at her side, Maria and Standing Bull flanking them, the entire band gathering behind in a show of solidarity. Ezekiel Whitman looked older than when she'd last seen him, his face more deeply lined, his hair more gray than brown, but his eyes held the same cold fury that had terrorized her childhood, and beside him sat a man who made Sarah's blood run cold. Judge Harold Patterson from Redemption Creek, the same man who had signed her marriage contract to Jeremiah without her consent. "There you are," her father said, his voice carrying that dangerous quiet tone that had always preceded violence. "My daughter dressed like a savage breeding with one too, I see." "I'm not your daughter anymore," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I haven't been since the night you tried to sell me to Jeremiah Colt." "Sell you?" Judge Patterson spoke up, his voice oily with false concern. "Your father arranged a respectable marriage for you. You murdered your intended husband and fled with these hostiles. We're here to see justice done." "Justice?" Sarah laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. "Was it justice when my father broke my ribs when I was 12? Was it justice when Jeremiah put his hands on me before any wedding? Was it justice when you signed papers binding me to a man I'd refused?" "You had no right to refuse," her father snarled. "You're my property until you're married." "I am married," Sarah interrupted, taking Joseph's hand, "by Lakota law recognized by treaty. I'm Wiaka Win, wife of Joseph Running Elk, and I carry his child. You have no claim on me." Her father's face went purple with rage. "That's no marriage. That's an abomination. You're coming with me if I have to drag you." "Try it," Joseph said quietly, and though his voice was calm, there was death in it. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah could see fingers moving toward triggers, hands gripping rifle stocks. One wrong move, and the valley would become a killing ground. She thought of the child moving inside her, of the children playing back at the camp of the elders who had already seen too much death. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. "Father Judge Patterson, you came all this way. Why? Not for love of me, you never loved me. Not for justice, you never cared about that either. So why?" Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "There's the matter of your inheritance." Sarah blinked in confusion. What inheritance? We have nothing. Your mother's family, Patterson said reluctantly. They had land in California gold mining claims. When they died last winter, it all passed to your mother, and through her to you. But only if you're respectable, married properly, living as a Christian woman should. The truth hit Sarah like cold water. They didn't want her. They wanted what she might be worth. How much? She asked. Enough, her father said greedily. Enough to make us all rich if you stop this foolishness and come home. Sarah started laughing. She laughed until tears ran down her cheeks, until she had to hold her belly, until Joseph put a concerned hand on her back. You think I care about money? You think I would trade this? She gestured to the valley. The people her husband, for gold, I never knew existed. You would throw away a fortune to live like an animal, Patterson asked, genuinely bewildered. I would throw away 100 fortunes to live free, Sarah replied. The inheritance can rot for all I care. Her father dismounted, striding toward her with the purposeful walk she remembered from countless nightmares. You stupid, ungrateful girl. You'll come with me if... He reached for her, and several things happened at once. Joseph moved to intercede, Standing Bull raised his rifle, and the hired guns went for their weapons. But it was Sarah who acted decisively. She pulled the knife from her belt, a new one given to her by Maria Sharp, and held it to her own throat. Stop, she shouted, and everyone froze. Father, you take one more step. You or any of your men make one move toward this camp, and I'll end this here. The inheritance dies with me. You get nothing. You wouldn't, her father said, but uncertainty colored his voice. I killed Jeremiah to save the man I love, Sarah said steadily. You think I wouldn't die to save the people who have become my family? I've been dead inside most of my life because of you. Actual death holds no fear for me. The standoff stretched long and tense. Sarah could feel the baby kicking as if protesting the danger, but she held the knife steady. She had learned many things in her time with the Lakota, but perhaps the most important was this. Sometimes the only power you had was the power to choose your own ending. It was Judge Patterson who broke first. Ezekiel, perhaps we should reconsider. The girl is clearly disturbed, and if she dies, the inheritance goes to distant cousins anyway. We get nothing. Her father's face was a study in frustrated rage, but greed won over pride. This isn't over, he said to Sarah. You're no daughter of mine, but that money should be mine by rights. I'll find a way. His words were cut off by a sound that made everyone turn a roar like nothing Sarah had ever heard coming from upriver. Joseph's face went pale. Flash flood, he said. Everyone moved to high ground. Now. The wall of water that came around the bend was monstrous brown with mud and debris moving with the force of an avalanche. It must have been raining hard in the mountains, sending all that water rushing down into their valley. There was no time for organized retreat, only chaos as everyone ran for the ridges. Sarah tried to run, but her pregnancy made her clumsy, slow. She stumbled and would have fallen if Joseph hadn't caught her, half carrying her toward safety. Behind them, she could hear screaming men and horses caught by the water, swept away in its furious current. They almost made it. They were so close to the ridge when Sarah saw him, her father clinging to a rock, as the water rose around him, his horse already gone. Their eyes met across the chaos, and in his she saw something she'd never seen before, fear. Sarah, he screamed, help me! She could have kept going, should have kept going. Joseph was pulling her toward safety. The water was rising fast, and her father had never shown her mercy. But something in her, maybe her mother's gentleness that had survived despite everything, maybe the Lakota teaching that all life was sacred, maybe just the humanity her father had tried to beat out of her, made her stop. Joseph, we have to help him. Joseph looked at her like she'd gone mad. He came here to take you to hurt you. I know, but if I let him die when I could save him, then he wins. He makes me like him. Joseph studied her face for a moment, then nodded. Together they waded back into the rising water, Joseph's strength keeping them anchored as they reached for her father. Ezekiel grabbed for them desperately, and for a moment Sarah thought they might all be swept away. But Standing Bull appeared with a rope, other warriors forming a human chain, and together they pulled all three to safety. They collapsed on the ridge, gasping and soaked. Ezekiel looked at Sarah with something like shock. You saved me. After everything, you saved me. Yes, Sarah said simply, because that's who I choose to be. The flood raged for hours, transforming their peaceful valley into a violent river. When it finally receded, the devastation was complete. Their camp was gone, washed away along with most of their supplies. Of the men who had come with her father, only 8 survived Patterson, among them all looking shocked and defeated. As the band gathered to assess the damage and count their losses, Sarah noticed Jeremiah's cousin among the survivors, a young man named Thomas, who had always been kind to her in Redemption Creek, one of the few who had ever shown her compassion. Thomas, she said, approaching him carefully, you came with them. He looked ashamed. Your father paid well and times are hard. I'm sorry, Sarah. I didn't understand what this was really about. And now, Thomas looked around at the Lakota people working together to salvage what they could, sharing what little they had saved, caring for the injured, regardless of whether they were Indian or white. Now I think maybe you found something better than what you left. It was Standing Bull who made the decision that would change everything. We cannot stay here, he announced. The valley is ruined, and these men know where we are. More will come. Where will we go? Maria asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. North, Standing Bull said. To Canada, maybe. Or to join Sitting Bull if we can find him. But we cannot stay here. Judge Patterson spoke up, surprising everyone. If you let us go, I'll make sure no one follows. I'll report that Sarah Whitman died in the flood. The inheritance will go to the cousins, your father will have no reason to pursue you, and the government will stop looking for a white woman who no longer exists. Sarah studied his face. Why would you do that? Patterson looked uncomfortable. Because I saw you save your father when you had every reason to let him drown. Because I've seen how these people treat you versus how we treated you. Because maybe I've been wrong about some things. Her father said nothing, just stared at Sarah with those cold eyes that had haunted her childhood. But something was different now. The power was gone from his gaze. He was just an old man, wet and defeated, stripped of the authority that had made him terrifying. You're dead to me, he said finally. My daughter is dead. Your daughter died a long time ago, Sarah replied. The moment you raised your fist to her the first time. But Wiyaka Win lives, and she is free. The white men left the next morning, those who could still ride, doubling up on the surviving horses. Sarah watched them go from a ridge, Joseph beside her, his hand protective on her belly. Her father never looked back, and Sarah felt something release in her chest. Not forgiveness, never that, but freedom from the weight of his hatred. Do you trust them? Joseph asked. To keep their word. Patterson, maybe. My father never. But it doesn't matter now. Sarah Whitman is dead. Let her rest. The band packed what little they had salvaged and began the long journey north. It was harder now with so much lost with Sarah, so heavily pregnant, with the constant fear of pursuit. But there was also a strange lightness to it, as if surviving the flood had washed away more than just their possessions. It had washed away the last chains binding Sarah to her old life. They traveled slowly, carefully, following ancient paths that white men didn't know existed. Along the way, they met other bands, other refugees from the increasing pressure of westward expansion. Some joined them, swelling their numbers. Others shared what news they had. Sitting Bull was indeed in Canada. The agencies were worse than expected, and the buffalo were almost gone. It was during a rest at a place called Eagle Rock that Sarah's pains began. They were still weeks from anywhere safe, but babies keep their own time, and this one had decided that now was the moment to enter the world. The labor was long and difficult. Sarah had helped with births before, but being the one in labor was entirely different. The pain came in waves that threatened to drown her, each one worse than the last. Maria and the other women surrounded her with their strength, their songs, their ancient knowledge of bringing life into the world. I can't, Sarah gasped at one point, exhausted and overwhelmed. You can, Maria said firmly. You are Wiyaka Win. You flew from a cage, you survived the prairie, you chose love over fear. This is just one more flight. Joseph stayed with her against tradition, but with Maria's permission holding her hand, his presence an anchor in the storm of pain. You are the strongest person I know, he whispered. Our child is lucky to have you as a mother. The baby came with the dawn, screaming their arrival into a complicated world. A daughter perfect and fierce with her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes, a bridge between worlds just as Sarah had imagined. What will you name her? Maria asked, cleaning the baby and placing her in Sarah's exhausted arms. Sarah looked at Joseph, and they both knew. Hope, Sarah said. Hope running elk, because that's what she is. Hope that there's a future where both her peoples can live in peace. The band celebrated the birth, quietly aware that even joy had to be careful in their fugitive state. But for that day at least, they allowed themselves to believe in the future that hope represented. Recovery from childbirth while traveling was its own challenge. Sarah rode when she could walk, when she couldn't ride, and nursed Hope through it all. The baby was strong, rarely crying, seeming to understand even as a newborn that silence could mean survival. It was Thomas of all people who brought them warning. He appeared in their camp 3 weeks after Hope's birth alone and travel-worn, his horse nearly dead from hard riding. They're coming, he gasped, barely able to stand. Your father went back on his word. He's bringing the army. Says you're holding white women and children hostage. They're maybe 2 days behind me. Sarah felt ice in her veins, but her voice was steady. Why warn us? Because what I saw in that valley after the flood, you saved your father. These people took in their enemies, fed us, tended our wounds. That's Christianity, real Christianity, not the version we practice in Redemption Creek. He looked at the baby in Sarah's arms. And because that child deserves a chance at life. Standing Bull made the decision quickly. We split up. Harder to track, harder to catch. Meet at the place where 3 rivers join in the moon of falling leaves. Sarah knew what this meant. Their small band, their chosen family, would scatter. Some might not survive to the meeting point. She looked at Maria, who had become the mother she'd never really had at Standing Bull, who had taught her strength at the others who had accepted her as one of their own. This is my fault, she said. I brought this on you. No, Maria said firmly. You brought yourself to us, and we chose to keep you. We do not regret our choices. They scattered that night, each group taking a different direction. Sarah, Joseph, Hope, and 5 others headed northwest toward the Badlands, where tracking would be difficult. Maria went east with another group. Standing Bull took the largest group north. The parting was painful but necessary. Sarah hugged Maria tightly, the older woman whispering blessings over Hope before disappearing into the darkness. She might never see her again, might never know if she survived. This was the price of freedom, constant loss, constant movement, constant uncertainty. They rode through the night, Hope silent against Sarah's chest, the stars their only guide. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, her father pursued his obsession. The army followed its orders, and the world they had known continued to collapse. But ahead lay possibility. Canada maybe, where the Queen's law was different, or deeper into the wilderness where white men feared to go, or perhaps just another day of freedom, which was all anyone could really ask for. As dawn broke over the Badlands, painting the rocks red as blood and gold as promise, Sarah looked at her daughter's sleeping face, at Joseph's determined profile, at the vast landscape that was both haven and threat. She thought of the frightened girl who had run barefoot from her father's farm and marveled at the distance between then and now. What are you thinking? Joseph asked softly. That every choice led to this moment, Sarah replied. The running, the fear, the pain, the joy, all of it was the path to holding our daughter while riding free under an endless sky. Was it worth it? He asked. All you've lost, all you've suffered. Sarah adjusted Hope in her arms, feeling the warm weight of possibility of future of love, freely given and freely received. Ask me when we're safe. We may never be safe, Joseph pointed out. Then we'll be free, Sarah said. And for people like us, freedom is safety enough. They descended into the Badlands as the sun rose higher, their small band disappearing into the maze of rock and shadow. Behind them, the dust of pursuit rose on the horizon. Ahead, the landscape offered 1,000 hiding places, 1,000 possible paths. Hope stirred in Sarah's arms, opening those startling blue eyes, to look at the world she'd been born into, a world of flight and struggle, but also of love and choice and the fierce determination to remain unbroken. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered the promise she'd made to herself that night in her father's barn. You will never know Cage's little one. You will never know chains. You will know struggle, yes, but you will also know that you have wings. The Badlands swallowed them, red rock and silence, and somewhere an eagle cried not in sorrow but in triumph, the sound of something wild that refused to be tamed. Sarah had become the eagle, and now she was teaching her daughter to fly. They climbed higher into the rocks, Joseph scouting ahead, always alert for danger. The others spread out, creating false trails, doubling back, using every trick generations of being hunted had taught them. Hope stayed quiet, as if she understood that her survival depended on silence. By midday, they had found a defensible position, a box canyon with only one entrance water seeping from the rocks, enough shelter to rest. They would stay here until nightfall, then move again. This would be their pattern for who knew how long, hide by day. Move by night, always one step ahead of those who would cage them. They're getting closer, one of the warriors reported. I saw dust maybe 10 miles back. Sarah felt her heart race, but her hands remained steady as she nursed hope. This was the life she had chosen, the price of refusing to submit. Every day of freedom had to be fought for, earned, defended. We could stand and fight, Joseph suggested, though his tone suggested he knew the futility of it. 5 warriors against the army. Standing Bull's nephew, who had stayed with their group, shook his head. That's not battle, that's suicide. Then we keep running, Sarah said. We run until we can't, and then we find another way. There's always another way. As the sun reached its peak, baking the Badlands into an oven, they herded horses, many of them echoing through the canyons. Her father had found their general direction, if not their exact location. It was only a matter of time. Sarah looked at Joseph, at their daughter, at the people who had chosen to risk everything for their freedom. She thought of all the choices that had led to this moment, all the times she could have chosen safety over liberty, silence over truth, submission over resistance. I regret nothing, she said aloud to Joseph, to herself, to the universe that had tested her in every possible way. Joseph smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face. Nor do I Wiaka win, nor do I. They prepared to move again deeper into the Badlands, higher into the rocks where horses couldn't follow. Hope made a small sound, not quite a cry, and Sarah soothed her with a Lakota lullaby. Maria had taught her a song about eagles and freedom and the strength found in flight. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the canyon, and in those shadows Sarah saw their future, always running, perhaps always fighting, certainly, but always free. She had learned that freedom wasn't a destination, but a choice made again and again, every day, every moment. As they climbed higher, leaving false trails and doubling back, Sarah heard the soldiers enter the canyon below. Her father's voice echoed off the rocks, demanding threatening, promising rewards for her capture. But his voice had lost its power over her. He was just noise now, like the wind, something to be aware of, but not feared. They reached a ridge as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon. From here they could see for miles the Badlands stretching out like a Red Sea, the prairie beyond and far to the north, the promise of mountains where a small band might disappear forever. We'll make it, Joseph said quietly, his hand finding hers. Sarah believed him. They had survived everything else, her father's violent society's chains, nature's fury, the government's pursuit. They would survive this too because they had something stronger than armies or anger or the weight of history against them. They had chosen each other, chosen freedom, chosen to build something new from the ashes of what had been. Hope gurgled in her arms, and Sarah looked down at her daughter. This perfect blend of 2 worlds, this living proof that love could transcend the boundaries others built. She would grow up free, would know her own strength, would never question her right to choose her own path. The sun painted the Badlands gold and crimson as they descended the far side of the ridge, leaving the sounds of pursuit behind. They were not safe, might never be safe, but they were free. And for Sarah, who had begun this journey as a prisoner in her own life, freedom was the only home that mattered. The Badlands had hidden them for 3 days, but even stone and shadow couldn't conceal them forever. They emerged on the northern edge as the moon waned, Hope crying for the first time since their flight began, her wails echoing off the rocks like a beacon. Sarah pressed her daughter to her breast, trying to quiet her, but the baby sensed what the adults knew: they were running out of places to run. "She's hungry," Sarah whispered to Joseph, though they both knew it was more than that. The constant movement, the stress, the fear that radiated from the adults like heat from a fire, all of it was affecting their daughter. "My milk is drying up." Joseph's jaw tightened. They had been living on dried meat and what little water they could find seeping from rocks. It wasn't enough for a nursing mother, wasn't enough for any of them, really. But Sarah was suffering most. He could see it in the hollows beneath her eyes, the way her clothes hung loose despite her recent pregnancy, the tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. "There's a trading post," Standing Bull's nephew Samuel White Crow said quietly. "Maybe half a day north, run by a Frenchman who doesn't ask questions." "It could be a trap," another warrior, Marcus Stonehand, argued. "If her father has spread word, offered reward, everything could be a trap," Sarah said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of endless vigilance. "But hope needs more than I can give her right now." They moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward the trading post, every sound making them freeze, every shadow a potential threat. Sarah rode with hope bound to her chest, the baby finally quiet, but that worried her more than crying. Quiet babies were often sick babies or worse. The trading post sat alone on the prairie like a squat mushroom smoke rising from its chimney, suggesting life within. They approached carefully, Joseph and Samuel going ahead to scout, while the others waited in a grove of cottonwoods by the creek. Sarah watched them go, her heart hammering against her ribs where hope lay. The baby was too warm, her breathing too shallow. Fear clawed at Sarah's throat, not fear of capture now, but the primal terror of a mother whose child was failing. "She'll be all right," Marcus Stonehand said softly beside her. He had 3 children back at the agency, had made the agonizing choice to leave them in relative safety while he fought for their future freedom. "Children are stronger than we think." "She's only 3 weeks old," Sarah whispered. "She shouldn't have to be strong yet." Joseph returned quickly, his face grim but not panicked. "The trader is alone, says he hasn't seen soldiers in a week. He has supplies, medicine, food." But what?" Sarah demanded. "He wants payment, and we have nothing left to trade except—" Joseph's eyes went to the rifle across Sarah's saddle, the one item of value they'd managed to save from the flood. "Take it," Sarah said immediately. "Take everything if he needs it. Hope matters more than weapons." The trading post was dim and smoky inside, smelling of tobacco leather and something cooking that made Sarah's stomach clench with hunger. The trader, a grizzled man named Baptiste, looked them over with shrewd eyes that missed nothing: the baby's condition, Sarah's exhaustion, the way the warriors positioned themselves to watch all entrances. "You are the ones they look for," he said in accented English. It wasn't a question. Sarah's hand went to the knife at her belt, but Baptiste waved dismissively. "I do not care for the troubles between whites and Indians. Bad for business to choose sides. But the child, she needs help, non—" "Yes," Sarah said simply. "Please." Baptiste studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I have goat's milk canned from the last supply wagon. Medicine, too, for the fever. But the price—" "Name it," Joseph said. "Not money, not guns." Baptiste's eyes went to Sarah. "Information. There is man, a Lakota warrior named Red Sky. He was my friend, traded with me for many years. He disappeared 2 moons ago. His family says he went to scout soldier movements near the Black Hills. You hear anything?" Sarah saw Joseph and Samuel exchange glances. They knew something. "Red Sky is dead," Samuel said quietly. "Soldiers caught him near Fort Robinson. They made an example of him." Baptiste's face crumpled briefly before hardening again. "His family. Safe. They made it to Canada last moon." The trader nodded slowly, then began pulling items from his shelves: cans of milk, a bottle of medicine-dried fruit, even a small sack of flour. Far more than they could have paid for with the rifle. "For Red Sky," he said simply. "And for the child who should not suffer for the stupidity of men." Sarah fed Hope the goat's milk mixed with water, and the medicine Baptiste showed her how to measure. Within an hour, the baby's fever broke. Her breathing eased, and she looked up at her mother with those startling blue eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of ancient souls. "Thank you," Sarah said to Baptiste, the words inadequate for the gift of her daughter's life. "You want to thank me," the trader said. "Survive. Both of you. Show them that their world is not the only world." They stayed hidden near the trading post for 2 days, letting hope recover, letting Sarah regain some strength. Baptiste brought them news along with supplies. The army had given up the chase, declared Sarah dead in the Badlands. Her father had returned to Redemption Creek empty-handed and furious, and most importantly, there was a group of Lakota heading to Canada who would pass nearby in 3 days. "It's too convenient," Marcus worried. "Too much good fortune at once." "Sometimes," Joseph said, watching Sarah nurse Hope with milk that was actually nourishing both of them, "fortune is just fortune. Not everything is a trap." But Marcus was partially right. The group of Lakota did come, and they did welcome Sarah's small band to join them, but they also brought news that changed everything. Sitting Bull had sent word from Canada the Canadian government was having second thoughts about harboring American Indians. There were negotiations, pressures, threats to cut off trade. The sanctuary they'd hoped for might not exist much longer. "Where do we go?" Sarah asked that night, as they camped with the larger group, feeling safer in numbers, but knowing safety was always temporary. "Where is there left?" "West," said an elder woman named Martha Crow, Feather Maria's cousin who had been with Sitting Bull's band. "There are mountains where white men don't go, valleys hidden in clouds, places where a small band could disappear." "For how long?" Samuel asked bitterly. "They will find every valley, claim every mountain fence, every stream eventually." "Then we take what time we can," Martha replied. "Every day our children live free is a victory." Sarah looked down at Hope sleeping peacefully for the first time since they'd fled the flood. Every day was a victory. She'd learned that truth in her father's house, where some days victory was simply surviving until tomorrow. Now victory meant something more. It meant Hope would know the taste of freedom, even if only for a while. The larger group moved northwest, following old trails that skirted settlements and army patrols. Sarah found comfort in their numbers and the way the women immediately absorbed her into their daily rhythms, sharing the work of child-rearing, teaching her songs and stories to pass on to Hope. It was during this time that Sarah truly understood what she'd only glimpsed before, the depth of loss these people carried. Every elder had stories of when the buffalo covered the plains, when they could travel freely from summer to winter grounds, when their children didn't have to fear schools that would steal their language and souls. Every adult remembered relatives killed, land taken, promises broken. Every child grew up knowing they were hunted. "How do you bear it?" Sarah asked Martha one evening as they watched the children play despite everything. "How do you keep going when so much has been lost?" "Because stopping means they win," Martha said simply. "Every day we continue, every child we raise in the old ways, every story we tell, it's resistance. You should understand this, Wiyaka Win. You chose to run rather than submit. That was resistance. You chose to save your father despite his cruelty. That was resistance too, refusing to become what they tried to make you." Sarah thought about that as they traveled, Hope growing stronger each day, beginning to focus on faces, to grip fingers with surprising strength. She was resisting too, this baby who shouldn't exist, this blend of two peoples who were supposed to be enemies. Her very existence was defiance. It was near the place where 3 rivers joined that everything changed again. They had been traveling for 2 weeks, making good time, spirits lifting as they neared the designated meeting place where they hoped to reunite with Maria Standing Bull and the others who had scattered. Sarah saw the smoke first, black and thick, not the gray of campfires, but the dark billowing of something terrible. Joseph tried to stop her from riding ahead, but she knew somehow, she knew what they would find. The meeting place was destroyed, not just raided, but obliterated. Bodies lay scattered among burned teepees, and Sarah recognized too many faces, people who had shared their food during the hungry winter, who had celebrated Hope's birth, who had chosen freedom over safety. Maria lay near the center of what had been the camp, her body covering 2 children she'd tried to protect. Sarah dropped from her horse, Hope clutched to her chest, and fell to her knees beside the woman who had given her a new name, a new life, a new understanding of what mother could mean. "No," she whispered. Then louder, "No." Her scream sent birds fleeing from nearby trees. made Hope cry, brought Joseph running. Standing Bull was there too, still breathing, but barely. Joseph and Samuel carried him to shade, tried to make him comfortable, but the wounds were too many, too deep. They knew, he gasped. Someone told them where we would meet. Sarah's mind raced. Who knew? Only those who had scattered that night, only their own people, only. Thomas, she breathed. Her father's man who had warned them, who had seemed so changed by what he'd witnessed. He stayed close enough to follow us to hear the plan. Why? Joseph asked, though the answer was obvious. My father, Sarah said bitterly. He must have promised Thomas a share of the inheritance if he helped find me. And Thomas knew I wouldn't leave wounded, wouldn't abandon the gathering place if there were survivors to help. She was right. Even as they tended to Standing Bull tried to gather the few survivors, she heard the thunder of approaching horses. Many horses. Too many to fight. Take Hope and run, she said to Joseph. I'll delay them. We run together or not at all, Joseph replied firmly. They don't want you. They want me. If I'm not here, if you're not here, they'll kill everyone anyway to hide what they've done. It was Standing Bull using his last strength to speak truth. This was never just about you, Win. It was about destroying those who helped you, who showed that their world isn't the only way. The soldiers arrived like a plague of locusts surrounding the destroyed camp, weapons drawn. But it wasn't Captain Morrison leading them this time. It was a younger officer, ambitious and cold-eyed, with Sarah's father beside him, looking triumphant. Sarah Whitman, the officer called out. By order of the federal government, you're under arrest for the murder of Jeremiah Colt, for inciting Indian rebellion, and for endangering the peace of the territory. Sarah stood slowly, hope still bound to her chest. She looked at the bodies around her, at Maria's still form, at Standing Bull dying in Joseph's arms. All these deaths because she had dared to choose her own life. I'll come, she said, her voice carrying across the killing ground. But only if you let the survivors go, all of them. You're in no position to negotiate, her father said. Sarah drew her knife, held it not to her own throat this time, but hovering over Hope. I am a mother whose child is threatened. There is no more dangerous position than that. The officer paled. Killing an Indian woman was one thing, but a baby, a half-white baby, at that in front of witnesses, that would be harder to explain in reports. Terms, he said curtly. The survivors go free. No pursuit, no punishment. They're given safe passage to wherever they choose, and my daughter stays with her father. No? Her father stepped forward. That half-breed abomination is your granddaughter, Sarah said coldly. Your blood runs in her veins whether you like it or not. And if you want any chance at that inheritance, you'll need me alive and cooperative. Kill my child, harm these people, and I'll find a way to end myself before we reach any courthouse. The standoff stretched taut. Sarah could feel Joseph behind her, ready to fight, ready to die. But she also felt Hope's warmth against her chest, the rapid beat of her tiny heart, the future that deserved a chance. Agreed, the officer said finally. The survivors go free. The child stays with its father. No, Joseph said, stepping forward. Where Sarah goes, I go. That's not the deal, the officer said. Then there's no deal, Sarah said, knife still steady. More negotiation, more threats. Finally, a compromise. Joseph could accompany them to the fort, could stay with Hope, but Sarah would stand trial alone. As they prepared to leave, Standing Bull called Sarah over with a weak gesture. She knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. Don't weep for me, Win, he whispered. I die free. That's more than many can say. He pressed something into her hand, a small leather pouch. For Hope, when she's old enough, so she knows who her people were. Standing Bull died as the sun set his last breath, carrying his spirit to join his ancestors. They buried him quickly, along with Maria and the others, Sarah singing the Lakota death song Maria had taught her, her voice breaking but continuing because the dead deserved that much. The journey to Fort Robinson took 5 days. Sarah rode with her hands bound, Hope taken from her and given to Joseph, who rode beside her. Her father tried to speak to her several times, but she turned away each time, having nothing to say to the man who had orchestrated such slaughter for money. You could have had everything, he said on the 3rd day. Wealth, comfort, respectability. I have everything, Sarah replied. I have a daughter who will know her own strength. I have a husband who sees me as an equal. I have the memory of people who loved me without conditions. You can take my freedom, maybe even my life, but you can't take those truths. At Fort Robinson, Sarah was separated from Joseph and Hope, locked in a small cell that reminded her painfully of her room in her father's house. Another cage, and another locked door. Another man deciding her fate. The trial was a foregone conclusion. The judge brought from Omaha was a friend of her father's. The witnesses were all white men who hadn't been there. Her testimony was dismissed as the ravings of a woman corrupted by savages. The fact that she'd killed Jeremiah in defense of another was irrelevant. She had no right to defense, no right to choose who lived or died. But Sarah had learned things in her time with the Lakota, including the power of truth spoken loudly enough. When they let her speak before sentencing, she didn't plead for mercy. Instead, she told the whole story. Her father's abuse, the forced marriage, Jeremiah's violence, the freedom she'd found with the Lakota, the massacre at the meeting place. You can hang me, she concluded, looking directly at the assembled townspeople who'd come to watch the spectacle. But you can't hang the truth. Every woman in this room who's been hit by her husband, every child who's cowered from their father's rage, every person who's been told they're property rather than human, they know the truth. And someday that truth will be louder than your laws. The judge sentenced her to hang, but something unexpected happened. The officer who'd arrested her, who'd seen the massacre site, stood up. Your Honor, he said, his voice uncertain but growing stronger, I request clemency. The woman saved her father's life during a flood despite his treatment of her. She surrendered to save others. And what we did at that camp, that wasn't justice. That was slaughter. The courtroom erupted. Her father raged. The judge pounded his gavel, but the seed of doubt was planted. Others began to speak. Baptiste the traitor had come testifying about Sarah's character. Thomas Shocking, everyone admitted his role in the betrayal and begged for Sarah's forgiveness and freedom. Even some townspeople from Redemption Creek women mostly began to quietly speak about what they knew of Ezekiel Whitman's temper and Jeremiah Colt's reputation. The judge, faced with unexpected opposition, and perhaps aware that hanging a young mother would not play well in Eastern newspapers that were beginning to question Western justice, commuted the sentence to exile. Sarah was to leave the territory, never return, and forfeit any claim to inheritance. I accept, Sarah said immediately, then looked at her father. The money was never real to me anyway. You can have it all. I hope it brings you the happiness your cruelty never could. They released her at dawn, Joseph waiting with Hope and 2 horses. Her father was there too one last time, looking older and somehow smaller in the morning light. You could have been someone, he said. I am someone, Sarah replied, taking Hope from Joseph and holding her daughter close. I'm Wiyaka Win. I'm a mother. I'm a survivor. I'm free. She mounted her horse without looking back, Joseph beside her. Hope secure in her arms. They rode east toward the sunrise, toward states where their marriage might be recognized, where Hope could go to school, where they could build something new from the ashes of all they'd lost. Miles from Fort Robinson. Sarah finally allowed herself to cry for Maria, for Standing Bull, for all the dead, for the girl she'd been, and the innocence she'd lost. Joseph reached over and took her hand, their horses walking side by side. Where do we go? He asked. Sarah thought of the leather pouch Standing Bull had given her, still unopened in her pocket. She thought of Maria's lessons, of the stories she would tell, hope, of the strength that came from choosing your own path, no matter the cost. Forward, she said, we go forward. We find others like us, people caught between worlds, people who refuse to fit into the boxes others build. We create something new. That sounds like a dream, Joseph said, but he was smiling. All freedom starts as a dream, Sarah replied, adjusting Hope in her arms. The baby was awake, those blue eyes, taking in the vast sky, the endless prairie, the unlimited possibilities of a world that would try to cage her but would never succeed if Sarah had anything to say about it. They rode through the day, stopping only to rest the horses and feed Hope. As evening approached, they made camp by a small stream, and Sarah finally opened Standing Bull's pouch. Inside was a perfectly preserved eagle feather, smaller than the one that had given her her name, and a note written in English in Maria's careful hand. She must have helped Standing Bull prepare it before the scatter. "For Hope Running Elk," it read. "So she knows she was born free, will live free, and will teach others to fly. The eagle recognizes its own." Sarah tied the feather into Hope's soft hair with a piece of leather, the baby gurgling happily at the attention. Joseph built a fire, and they sat together as darkness fell, a family forged in flight and struggle bound by choice rather than blood, stronger for all they'd survived. "Tell me a story," Joseph said, "one to remember this day." Sarah thought for a moment, then began, her voice carrying across the prairie like Maria's once had. "There was once a girl who lived in a cage who believed that was all there was. But one day she discovered she had wings." Hope listened with those wise eyes, as if she understood every word, as if she was already memorizing the story she would one day tell her own children about the grandmother who chose freedom, the grandfather who chose love, and the mother who chose to fight so that choice itself would survive. The stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had witnessed Sarah's flight from Redemption Creek, her transformation into Wayaka. When the birth of hope, the deaths of heroes, and now this new beginning. They were constants in a world of change, proof that some things endured no matter how dark the night became. "I love you," Sarah said to Joseph, to Hope, to the memory of those they'd lost, to the future they were building word by word, choice by choice. "And we love you," Joseph replied, speaking for their daughter, for their scattered people, for all those who would hear their story and know that cages could be escaped, that love didn't require ownership, that freedom was worth any price. They slept under those stars. Hope between them safe for this night, at least. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to their freedom, new tests of their resolve. But tonight they were together. They were alive, and they were free. The wind sang through the grass, carrying the scent of rain, and tomorrow, and somewhere in the darkness, an eagle cried, not in sorrow, but in triumph, the sound of wings that refused to be clipped of spirits, that refused to break of love, that refused to be caged. Sarah dreamed of flying Hope in her arms, Joseph beside her, Maria, and Standing Bull watching from the clouds with approval. In the dream, the earth spread out below them like a promise, vast and varied and full of places where those who didn't fit could build their own world. When she woke at dawn, Hope was smiling, her tiny hand wrapped around the eagle feather in her hair. Joseph was already awake, watching the sunrise paint the prairie gold. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." Sarah confirmed, knowing he meant ready for whatever came next, ready to fight for Hope's future, ready to honor the dead by living fully. They mounted their horses and continued east toward the unknown, toward possibility, toward a horizon that promised nothing, except the chance to keep choosing freedom one day at a time, one choice at a time, one flight at a time. The town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, was nothing like Redemption Creek. It sat along the river like a promise of something better, with its neat streets and buildings that spoke of prosperity without the harsh edges of frontier justice. Sarah, Joseph, and Hope had been traveling for 3 weeks since leaving Fort Robinson, following rivers and trading posts, avoiding main roads, and anywhere that might have heard of the woman who killed a white man and lived with Indians. But here in this town, where the railroad brought strangers daily and commerce mattered more than history, they might find the anonymity they needed to build something new. Hope was crying again, the kind of persistent wail that meant she was hungry, and no amount of soothing would substitute for milk. Sarah's supply had returned somewhat with regular food and rest, but it wasn't enough. They needed stability walls, a place where Hope could grow without the constant movement that had defined her first months of life. "There," Joseph said quietly, pointing to a sign in a boarding house window. "Rooms to let, monthly rates available." The proprietress, a German widow named Mrs. Hoffman, looked them over with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Joseph's obvious Indian heritage, Sarah's weathered hands and sun-darkened skin, the baby who looked like both and neither of her parents. But she also saw the wedding ring Joseph had traded for at the last post, the way they held themselves with quiet dignity, and most importantly, the silver coins Joseph placed on her desk, payment from pelts he'd trapped and sold along their journey. "I run a respectable establishment," Mrs. Hoffman said carefully. "No drinking, no fighting, no visitors after 9 o'clock. We want only peace," Sarah replied. A safe place for our daughter to grow. Mrs. Hoffman studied Hope, who had stopped crying and was staring at the older woman with those startling blue eyes. Something in the landlady's expression softened. I had a daughter once, she said quietly. The fever took her before her first birthday. She cleared her throat, all business again. Third floor, end of the hall. Breakfast is at 7, dinner at 6. You'll keep to yourselves and cause no trouble. Yes, ma'am, Sarah said, understanding the unspoken terms they would be tolerated as long as they remained invisible. The room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the river and let in morning light. Sarah stood there holding Hope, watching boats move along the water, and felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten its name, safety. Not complete, not permanent, but enough to take a full breath without looking over her shoulder. Joseph found work at the lumber mill within days, his strength and willingness to take the most dangerous jobs, making him valuable enough that the foreman overlooked his heritage. Sarah took in washing and mending skills she'd learned in her father's house, transformed into honest wages. They were Mr. and Mrs., running elk to those who asked, though most didn't, preferring to pretend the Indian and his white wife didn't exist as long as they caused no problems. It was there in that small room above the river that Hope learned to laugh. Real laughter, not just baby sounds, but genuine joy at Joseph making faces, or Sarah singing the Lakota lullabies Maria had taught her. Each laugh was a victory, proof that joy could exist even after so much loss. 3 months passed in relative peace. Hope grew strong, beginning to crawl with determined purpose across their small room. Sarah's nightmares faded from nightly to weekly. Joseph learned to read Sarah, teaching him with patience and pride, as he sounded out words from the Bible that Mrs. Hoffman had lent them, not for its religion, but for its availability. It was during this fragile peace that Thomas found them. Sarah was at the market. Hope bound to her back, selecting vegetables with the careful economy of someone who knew the value of every penny when she heard his voice. Sarah Whitman. She froze her hand instinctively, going to the knife she still carried, though it was now used for cutting bread rather than defense. But when she turned, Thomas's face held no threat, only a weariness that matched her own. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said quickly, hands raised to show he was unarmed. I've been looking for you for months, but not for him, not for your father. Then why? Sarah asked, shifting Hope higher on her back, ready to run if necessary. Thomas reached into his coat, slowly pulling out an envelope thick with papers. Your mother's family, the California inheritance. There was more to it than land and gold claims. There were letters, documents, things your father doesn't know about. Sarah wanted to walk away to protect the small peace they'd built, but curiosity won. They went to a small cafe where Thomas ordered coffee and Sarah tea, Hope playing with a spoon while Thomas explained. Your mother's family. They weren't just miners, he said, spreading papers on the table. They were abolitionists, part of the Underground Railroad before the war. They hid escaped slaves, helped them get to Canada. Your mother wrote to them about it. She was proud of them, wanted to be part of it. But your father, Thomas shrugged. Well, you know what your father thought of anyone who wasn't white and properly Christian. Sarah studied the letters. Her mother's careful handwriting describing dreams of a world where people were free to choose their own lives. It was like hearing her mother's voice from beyond the grave, the woman she might have been without Ezekiel's fists and control. Why are you showing me this? Sarah asked. Because there's more. Your mother's cousin, Elizabeth Harper. She's still alive. Lives in California, runs a school for children of all races. Indian, Mexican, Chinese, Negro, white. She's been looking for you, wants to meet you, and... Thomas paused, seeming to gather courage. She wants to offer you a position, teaching at the school. You and your husband both. Sarah felt the world tilt. A chance at legitimate work, a real home, a place where Hope could grow up, seeing all kinds of people living and learning together. It seemed too good to be true, which in her experience meant it probably was. What's the price? She asked bluntly. There's always a price. Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. I need your forgiveness. In writing. For my part in what happened at the meeting place. I can't sleep, Sarah. I see their faces. Maria standing bull the children. I helped cause that for money I didn't even take in the end." Sarah looked at him. Really looked at him. He'd lost weight. His eyes were hollowed with sleeplessness, and his hand shook slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. The guilt was eating him alive, and part of her, the part that had learned cruelty from her father, wanted to let it. But then hope gurgled, reaching for her mother, and Sarah remembered Maria's words about choosing who to be rather than letting others' cruelty shape you. "I'll write your letter," she said finally, "not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying hatred is too heavy when I have a child to carry instead. But know this, Thomas, their blood is still on your hands. My forgiveness won't wash that away. Only you can do that through how you live the rest of your life." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know. I'm going back to Redemption Creek to tell everyone what really happened, what your father did. It won't bring them back, but maybe it will prevent the next massacre." That evening, Sarah told Joseph about the offer. He listened quietly, then asked the crucial question. "Do you trust it?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But winter's coming, and the mill is already talking about laying off workers. We have enough saved for the journey, if we're careful. And Hope—" She looked at their daughter, who was pulling herself up on the furniture so close to walking. "Hope deserves to grow up somewhere that won't hate her for being both and neither." They decided to write to Elizabeth Harper first, to test the truth of Thomas's claims. The letter Sarah composed was careful, revealing little but expressing interest. The response came faster than expected, carried by telegram to the nearest office, and then hand-delivered by a breathless boy who'd never seen an Indian up close before. "My dearest niece," it read, "your mother spoke of you in every letter. Please come. The school needs teachers who understand that freedom is not given, but taken, not granted, but earned. Your daughter will be welcome here, as will your husband. We are building something new. Come help us build it. All love, Aunt Elizabeth." The decision to leave Cedar Falls wasn't easy. They had found a measure of peace there, a routine that felt almost like normal life. Mrs. Hoffman had even begun inviting them to take tea with her in the evenings, sharing stories of her own losses and the strength it took to continue. But peace without acceptance was just another kind of cage, prettier perhaps, but still confining. They left on a morning when frost painted the windows, and Hope took her first unassisted steps, stumbling from Sarah to Joseph, with a determination that brought tears to both their eyes. Mrs. Hoffman saw them off, pressing a small package into Sarah's hands. "For the little one," she said gruffly, "when she's older." Inside was a silver locket with a photograph of Mrs. Hoffman's own daughter, and on the back, engraved in tiny letters, "All children deserve to fly." The journey to California was its own odyssey. They took the train when they could afford it, wagons when they couldn't, and walked when necessary. Hope learned to walk properly during that journey, then to run her stubby legs, carrying her toward every new sight with fearless curiosity. She spoke her first word on the train through Kansas, bird, pointing at an eagle circling above the prairie. Her second word a day later was free, though Sarah wasn't sure if she was repeating what she'd heard or somehow understanding what the bird represented. They crossed deserts that reminded Sarah of her first flight into the unknown mountains that made the Badlands seem tame, and finally descended into the California Valley where Elizabeth Harper's school sat like an oasis of possibility. It was November, the air crisp but not cold, and the trees still held their leaves as if winter was just a suggestion here rather than a threat. Elizabeth Harper looked nothing like Sarah's mother. She was tall where Hannah had been small, robust, where Hannah had been delicate with silver hair that she wore proudly unpinned, and eyes that held the same fierce intelligence Sarah remembered in Maria. But when she smiled, Sarah saw her mother's kindness, the gentleness that Ezekiel had tried so hard to destroy. "You look like her," Elizabeth said, embracing Sarah with a warmth that broke through all her careful defenses. "Hannah's strength and something more, your own courage." She turned to Joseph, extending her hand without hesitation. "And you must be the man who helped my niece find her wings." The school was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. A large main building surrounded by smaller cottages, gardens where children of every shade worked side by side, a barn with horses and cattle, and everywhere the sound of languages, mixing English, Spanish, Lakota, Chinese, creating a symphony of human diversity. "We have 43 students," Elizabeth explained as she showed them around. "Orphans mostly, or children whose parents work the fields and ranches. We teach them reading and writing, yes, but also farming crafts, how to think for themselves. We're preparing them for a world that doesn't exist yet, but might someday a world where what you know matters more than what you look like. Sarah watched a group of children playing a Chinese boy teaching a Mexican girl and a white boy some kind of counting game, while a black girl and an Indian boy argued good-naturedly about the rules. Hope toddled toward them without hesitation, and they immediately adjusted their circle to include her. "She'll fit right in," Elizabeth said with satisfaction. "Children don't see differences until we teach them to." Sarah and Joseph were given a cottage on the edge of the property, small but sturdy, with 2 rooms and a garden plot. For the first time since leaving the Lakota camp, they had a home that was truly theirs. Joseph built furniture with the same care he'd once used to construct teepees, while Sarah made curtains and planted herbs that Maria had taught her to use. Teaching was harder than Sarah had expected, but also more rewarding. Her students ranged from 5 to 15, all at different levels, all carrying their own stories of loss and resilience. She taught them to read using stories from many cultures, not just the European fairy tales she'd grown up with, but Lakota legends. Joseph shared Mexican folk tales from the other teachers, African stories from formerly enslaved families, Chinese myths from the railroad workers' children. Joseph taught the older boys woodworking and hunting skills that transcended culture, but he also taught them respect for the land, for each other, for themselves. He had a gift for reaching the angry ones, the boys who'd been told they were worthless too many times to believe otherwise. Perhaps because he understood that anger had felt it himself and had learned to transform it into something useful. Hope grew like a wildflower in this garden of acceptance. She spoke her first sentence in 3 languages, played with children who looked like her and children who didn't, and never learned that she was supposed to be different or less than, or torn between worlds. She was simply Hope, and that was enough. It was during their second spring at the school that Sarah realized she was pregnant again. The knowledge filled her with both joy and terror. Joy at new life, terror at the memory of Hope's early months, the constant running, the hunger, the fear. But this child would be different. This child would be born into safety, into community, into a world that, while not perfect, at least had room for them. Joseph built a cradle with intricate carvings telling the story of their journey, an eagle in flight, a river and flood stars to navigate by and at the center, a small bird taking its first flight from the nest. "So they know where they come from," he explained, running his hand over the smooth wood. Elizabeth threw herself into preparing for the birth with the enthusiasm of a grandmother denied too long. She brought in a midwife who had delivered babies of every color and creed, who viewed Sarah's previous pregnancy and flight as evidence of strength rather than scandal. The whole school seemed invested in the coming child. The students made blankets and toys, the other teachers offered advice and remedies, and everyone spoke of the baby as already belonging to their extended chosen family. The labor was easier this time, perhaps because Sarah wasn't exhausted and starving, perhaps because she wasn't afraid. The midwife was skilled. Elizabeth was comforting, and Joseph was allowed to stay, holding her hand and singing Lakota songs that seemed to ease the pain. The baby came with the dawn, as Hope had, but this time to joy rather than flight. A son with Joseph's dark hair and Sarah's stubborn chin, who looked at the world with curious eyes as if asking what adventures it held. "What will you name him?" Elizabeth asked, cleaning the baby with practiced gentleness. Sarah and Joseph looked at each other, a whole conversation in that glance. They had discussed many names, but seeing him, the choice was clear. "Samuel Standing Bull Running Elk," Sarah said, "for the uncle who taught us strength and the warrior who showed us sacrifice." "That's a lot of name for such a small person." Elizabeth laughed. "He'll grow into it," Joseph said confidently. "They always do." Hope was fascinated by her brother patting his head gently and declaring him "mine baby" to anyone who would listen. She appointed herself his protector, bringing him leaves and flowers, and once memorably a very confused frog that she thought he might like to play with. Life settled into rhythms that felt sustainable rather than desperate. Sarah taught during the days Joseph worked the land and taught the boys, and in the evenings they gathered with the other families for meals that were chaotic and multilingual and full of the kind of laughter that comes from people who have chosen to build something together. There were challenges, of course. The outside world didn't approve of Elizabeth's school of racial mixing of Indian men married to white women of children who didn't know they were supposed to hate each other. There were threats, occasional violence from those who saw their very existence as an affront to the natural order. But there was also strength in numbers in community, in the fierce protection of people who had nowhere else to go, and so would defend this place with everything they had. When night riders came to burn the school, they found armed teachers and students ready to defend their home. When the state tried to shut them down, Elizabeth had lawyers and supporters in San Francisco who fought back. When individual families were threatened, the whole community responded. It was during Samuel's second winter that a letter arrived that would test everything they'd built. It was from Thomas writing from prison in Nebraska. He had indeed returned to Redemption Creek, had told the truth about the massacre, about Ezekiel's role in it, about the inheritance and the murders committed for greed. The town had turned on Ezekiel, the federal marshals had investigated, and Sarah's father had been arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. "He's asking for you," Thomas wrote. "He's dying, the cancer is eating him from the inside. He wants to see you before the end. I know you owe him nothing, but I thought you should know. You get to choose as you always should have." Sarah read the letter 3 times, then handed it to Joseph. He read it once and set it aside. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. She looked at her children, Hope playing with blocks, teaching Samuel colors, in the mixed language she'd created from all the ones she heard Samuel laughing at everything his sister did. "Part of me wants him to die alone, knowing that his cruelty cost him everything. But part of me—" She paused, searching for words. "Part of me wants to show him what he could never break." They went as a family, taking the train through landscapes Sarah remembered from her flight. Hope pressed her nose to the window, exclaiming at everything, while Samuel slept in Joseph's arms. Sarah watched the prairie roll by and marveled at how different it looked from this side of freedom. The prison in Omaha was a gray stone monument to human failure. Sarah had to argue to bring the children in, but Elizabeth had given her letters of introduction, and eventually they were led to a small room where dying prisoners were allowed final visits. Ezekiel Whitman was a shadow of the man who had terrorized Sarah's childhood. The cancer had eaten him down to bones, and bitter spirit, his hair gone, his hands shaking with palsy. But his eyes were the same cold, calculating, unrepentant. "So," he said, his voice a rasp, "you came." "I came," Sarah agreed, sitting across from him with Samuel in her arms and Hope hiding behind her skirts. "Though I'm not sure why." "To gloat," her father suggested. "To see me brought low." "No," Sarah said, and found it was true. "I came to show you what you missed." She lifted Samuel so Ezekiel could see him clearly. "This is your grandson, Samuel Standing Bull running elk. He's strong and healthy and will grow up knowing he's loved." She touched Hope's head. "And this is Hope, your granddaughter. She speaks 3 languages, can count to 20, and has never once been hit in anger." Ezekiel's face twisted. "Half-breeds, abominations." "Children," Sarah corrected. "Just children, who will grow up free, who will choose their own paths, who will know that love doesn't require pain." "You've destroyed our bloodline," Ezekiel said. "Polluted it." Joseph spoke for the first time. "We've strengthened it. Your grandchildren carry the blood of survivors, of warriors, of people who refuse to break. They'll be stronger than you ever were because they'll know how to love without possessing, to lead without dominating, to be strong without being cruel." Ezekiel turned his face away. "Get out. You're no daughter of mine." Sarah stood adjusting Samuel in her arms. "I never was. I was Mother's daughter, and she would be proud of who I've become." She paused at the door. "Goodbye, Father. I forgive you not for your sake, but for mine. I won't carry your poison into my children's lives." They left him there alone with his hatred and his cancer, and Sarah never looked back. She heard later that he died 2 days after their visit, cursing her name with his last breath. She felt nothing, not satisfaction, not sorrow, just a closing of a chapter that had gone on too long. The journey back to California was different. Hope had questions about the angry man, and Sarah answered them honestly but gently. "Some people choose to be mean," she explained, "but we choose to be kind. That's what makes us different." "Was he your papa?" Hope asked. "He was the man who raised me," Sarah said carefully. "But family is more than blood. Family is the people who love you right." "Like Aunt Elizabeth and all the teachers and all our friends?" Hope asked. "Exactly like that," Sarah confirmed. They returned to find the school thriving. Elizabeth had secured funding from progressive sponsors in San Francisco, and they were building a new dormitory for older students. The garden had expanded, and there were plans for a library. Most importantly, other schools were beginning to follow their model, creating spaces where children of all backgrounds could learn together. Sarah threw herself back into teaching with renewed purpose. She developed a curriculum that drew from many cultures, teaching history, that included all people's contributions, literature that went beyond European classics, mathematics, that showed how different civilizations had contributed to human knowledge. Joseph became the unofficial head of security for the school, training the older boys and some of the girls in self-defense, not to create fighters, but to create young people who knew they had the right to defend themselves and others. He also started teaching traditional Lakota ceremonies to any who wanted to learn, keeping alive the traditions that the government schools were trying to erase. Hope and Samuel grew like weeds in sunshine. Hope showed an early aptitude for languages, switching between them, with ease often translating for newer students who didn't speak English yet. Samuel, even as a toddler, showed Joseph's gift with his hands, building elaborate structures with blocks and sticks, creating things that shouldn't have been possible for someone so young. It was a warm September evening when Sarah realized they had achieved something she'd never dared dream of: normalcy. She was sitting on their cottage porch, watching Joseph teach Samuel to whittle, while Hope read aloud from a book, switching languages mid-sentence just to make her brother laugh. Other families were scattered around the grounds, the evening air filled with cooking smells and conversation and children's laughter. "This is what Maria dreamed of," Joseph said quietly, following her gaze. "A place where we could just live." Sarah reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Do you think she knows that we made it?" "I think she knows," Joseph said. "I think they all know, Maria Standing Bull, your mother. They're in every child who learns here, every seed we plant, every day we choose to build rather than destroy." That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Joseph stood outside looking at the stars. The same stars that had witnessed her flight from Redemption Creek, their meeting, Hope's birth, all the loss and struggle and triumph that had brought them here. "No regrets?" Joseph asked, pulling her close. Sarah thought of all the paths not taken, the easier choices she could have made. She could have married Jeremiah and lived a life of quiet desperation. She could have given up during that first terrible flight. She could have chosen safety over freedom at any of a dozen moments. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Every choice brought us here." A month later, Elizabeth called a meeting of all the teachers and older students. She had news from the state capital. California was considering legislation that would make integrated education illegal, that would force schools like theirs to close or segregate. "We'll fight," Elizabeth said, her elderly frame still radiating the strength that had built this place. "We'll use every legal means, every connection, every argument, but we must also prepare for the possibility that we'll lose." The room erupted in discussion, fear, anger, determination. Sarah felt the old familiar tightness in her chest, the feeling of walls closing in, of freedom being threatened yet again. But then Hope stood up, all of 7 years old, but with a presence that commanded attention. "If they close our school, we'll make another one. If they close that, we'll make another. They can't close our minds or our hearts." The room fell silent, then burst into applause. Elizabeth wiped tears from her eyes. "Out of the mouths of babes," she murmured. They fought the legislation with everything they had. Letters were written, petitions signed, delegations sent to Sacramento. Sarah even testified before a legislative committee, telling her story, explaining how education that embraced all cultures had saved not just her, but her children, had created citizens who could bridge divides rather than deepen them. She stood before those stern-faced men in their dark suits and spoke truth to power one more time. "You fear what we're creating because it proves your lies wrong. We're proving that people of different races can learn together, live together, thrive together. We're proving that the divisions you enforce are choices, not natural law. And yes, that should frighten you, because once children learn they can fly together, they won't accept cages anymore." The legislation failed by 3 votes. Not a victory so much as a reprieve. But they would take it. The school would continue, the children would keep learning, and slowly, gradually, the world might change. That spring, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This child she thought would be born into a world slightly better than the one Hope had entered, slightly more accepting than the one Samuel knew. Progress measured in inches rather than miles, but progress nonetheless. The pregnancy was difficult. Sarah was older now, worn by years of struggle, but she was surrounded by support. Elizabeth fussed over her like a mother hen, the other teachers took over her classes when needed, and the students competed to help with Hope and Samuel. The baby came during a thunderstorm that reminded Sarah of the night she'd fled Redemption Creek. But this time, she labored in a clean bed surrounded by skilled help and loving family. This time Joseph could hold her hand without fear of being sent away. This time Hope and Samuel waited just outside ready to meet their new sibling. It was another daughter, tiny but fierce, who announced her arrival with a cry that could probably be heard in the next county. She had Sarah's red hair, a surprise throwback to some Irish ancestor, and Joseph's high cheekbones. But mostly she looked like herself, new and unique and ready to take on the world. "What shall we name this one?" Joseph asked, cradling the baby with the practiced ease of an experienced father. Sarah thought of all they'd been through, all they'd overcome, all they still faced. She thought of Maria's strength, her mother's hidden dreams, Elizabeth's fierce protection. She thought of the school full of children who were learning to soar despite the world's attempts to clip their wings. "Freedom," she said. "Freedom, Maria Running Elk." Elizabeth laughed. "That's certainly making a statement." "Good," Sarah said, taking the baby and looking into those unfocused newborn eyes. "Let the world know who she is from the start. Let them know she was born free and will live free." As if in agreement, Freedom stopped crying and settled into her mother's arms with a small sigh of contentment. Outside, the storm was passing and sunlight broke through the clouds, painting rainbows across the California sky. Hope and Samuel were led in to meet their sister, approaching with the careful excitement of children who'd been thoroughly briefed on how to behave around babies. "She's small," Samuel observed. "You were smaller," Hope informed him loftily. "But she'll grow. We'll teach her everything, how to read and ride and run and fight if she needs to. And how to fly," Sarah added softly, thinking of that eagle feather still carefully preserved, waiting for each child to be old enough to understand its significance. That evening, as Sarah rested with Freedom, Joseph brought in a letter that had arrived during the storm. It was from Thomas, writing from Colorado, where he had started a newspaper dedicated to telling the truth about the West's violence against Native peoples. "I wanted you to know," he wrote, "that your story has traveled farther than you might imagine. I've shared it with your permission from that forgiveness letter, and it's inspiring others. Women leaving abusive situations, Native peoples fighting for their rights, anyone who's been told they have to accept their cage. You probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you don't reply. But know that Maria and Standing Bull's sacrifice and your survival means something. The ripples spread wider than you can see." Sarah set the letter aside to think about later. For now, she had her family around her, Joseph reading to Hope, and Samuel Elizabeth knitting in the corner, Freedom sleeping in her arms. The cottage was warm with lamplight and love full of the kind of peace she'd once thought impossible. But even in this peace, Sarah knew the fight wasn't over. Would never be over, really. There would always be those who wanted to cage others, to define them, to limit them. There would always be battles to fight freedoms, to defend children, to teach that they had wings. She thought of that scared girl running barefoot through the Nebraska prairie, blood on her feet and terror in her heart. That girl could never have imagined this, a home, a true partner, children who would grow up free, a community that celebrated rather than feared difference. But that girl had run anyway, had chosen the unknown over the unbearable, had discovered she had wings even as she was using them. "What are you thinking about?" Joseph asked, settling beside her on the bed, careful not to disturb Freedom. "How far we've flown," Sarah said, "and how much farther there is to go." "Are you tired?" he asked, concern in his voice. Sarah considered the question. She was tired, bone-deep weary from years of struggle. But she was also energized by purpose, by the knowledge that every day they survived and thrived was a victory. Every child they taught was a seed of change. Every choice they made to love rather than hate was resistance. "I'm tired," she admitted, "but I'm not done. Not nearly done." Joseph smiled and kissed her forehead. "Good, because I think Freedom here is going to keep us busy." As if in response, the baby stirred, opening her eyes to look at the world she'd been born into. Sarah saw in those eyes the same fierce spirit that had carried her through her darkest moments, the same refusal to accept limitations that had driven her from her father's house. "Hello, little warrior," she whispered. "Welcome to your battlefield. It's not the one we would have chosen for you, but it's the one we have. And we're going to teach you to fight with love instead of hate, with truth instead of lies, with wings instead of weapons." Freedom yawned, unimpressed by her mother's philosophy, and went back to sleep. But Sarah knew that someday this child and her siblings would understand. They would know their history, not the sanitized version that textbooks would tell, but the real story of struggle and triumph, of choosing love over fear, of building bridges where others built walls. The sun set over the California hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere an eagle cried that sound that had followed Sarah from the prairie to the mountains to this valley, where they were building something new. It was the sound of freedom, of refusal to be tamed, of the wild spirit that lived in everyone if they could just find the courage to let it fly. Sarah adjusted freedom in her arms and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to remember Maria's teachings. Standing Bull's sacrifice, her mother's hidden strength, the Lakota band that had shown her what family could be. They were all here in this room, in these children, in this life she and Joseph had built from the ashes of everything they'd lost. "Thank you," she whispered to those spirits, to the universe that had tested her and found her strong enough, to the eagle that had dropped its feather and changed her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The fight for the school would continue. Her children would face discrimination and hatred. The world would try to tell them they didn't belong anywhere, that their mixed blood made them less than whole. But tonight in this cottage, on the edge of possibility, surrounded by love and determination and the stubborn refusal to accept cages, they were complete. They were family. They were free. And somewhere in the gathering darkness carried on the wind that had once brought her terror, but now brought peace. Sarah heard it, the sound of wings. Not just her own anymore, but a whole flock rising together, refusing to be grounded, heading always toward the horizon where freedom lived just out of reach, but never out of sight. Word count 9,456 words.